If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
51. Don't touch my dog. Beretta sat down on a chair and said, I can't tell you where to find the elder. Hearing Beretta's refusal, John reluctantly stood up. Seeing John Wick getting up, Beretta continued, You don't understand. The elder is not someone you can simply find whenever you want. It's up to him to choose to find you. If you want to speak with him, go to the edge of the desert. Look up at Canis Minor, a constellation that follows Orion in the night sky. Follow the brightest star. Keep going until you are on the brink of death, and then keep going. When you have only your last breath left, he may come to find you, or he may not. Upon hearing Beretta's words, John Wick immediately said, I appreciate it. Sophia, standing beside him, also thanked Beretta. They then turned to leave. Seeing them depart, Beretta, who was still sitting in the chair, said, Perhaps you didn't pay attention to what I said about social contracts, social relationships. Just now, you received a gift from me. I was hosting your friend. As he spoke, Beretta gestured towards John Wick. He then got up and walked over to Sophia. How do you plan to repay me? Beretta returned to the dog he had petted earlier, crouched down, and petted it a few more times, saying, So gentle and yet so fierce. I like this dog. Looking at Sophia, Beretta continued, I want to keep him. Hearing Beretta's words, Sophia was surprised and asked, What did you say? Beretta slowly got up, still petting the dog. He said, This is my gift. You will use this to pledge your loyalty to me. Sophia decisively shook her head and refused, No. Disappointed, Beretta raised both hands and turned away while saying, Very well, very well. He then took a handgun from an open box on the table and aimed it at the dog, saying, Then I'll kill it. Bang! Beretta pulled the trigger, and the dog fell with a whimper. Sophia immediately knelt beside the dog, clutching its neck, and shouted, Doctor! Doctor! The sound of the gunshot reached the top floor, where the group had been watching the terrace. Ginny murmured again, Someone really killed a dog. Boss, didn't John's last encounter with Vigo and his son begin because of his love for his dog? Charles nodded and continued, Watch closely. This dog lover isn't any less temperamental than John. On the second-floor terrace, Beretta watched the panicked Sophia and insincerely said, I'm sorry, Sophia. This is a lesson for you. Upon hearing a whimper from the dog, Sophia reached out to touch it and found a bullet lodged in the dog's bulletproof vest. It turned out that Beretta's shot had only hit the vest. Sophia then turned to look at John Wick. John Wick sensed Sophia's intentions and warned, Don't. Sophia, with a determined look, pulled out a gun from the dog's vest and pointed it at Beretta's abdomen, firing a shot. She then immediately started shooting at the guards around them. Upon seeing Sophia open fire, John Wick had no choice but to join the fight. He grabbed a guard's submachine gun and started firing as well. At this moment, Beretta had just gotten up and couldn't do anything yet. The dog he had previously struck suddenly got up and lunged toward him, specifically targeting his groin. Beretta cried out in pain, Ah, ah, ah. The battle quickly ended under the onslaught of the two men and two dogs. Beretta was still on the ground, groaning in agony, his hand stained with blood. Sophia, holding her gun, walked up to Beretta, ready to finish him off. At this point, John Wick spoke up, Sophia, don't. After a glance at John Wick, Sophia adjusted her gun's aim and fired a shot at Beretta's thigh. She then said, He shot my dog. John Wick nodded and said, I understand. Beretta continued to moan on the ground as Sophia looked at him and said, We need to leave, now. After saying that, the two of them rushed out, guns in hand. Upstairs, Charles and the others witnessed everything that had happened below, including Beretta's gruesome situation. Thinking about Beretta's future, he felt a chill run down his spine. At this point, Erica spoke up, Boss, do we need to go down and help? Charles hesitated for a moment and then said, Let's go, we need to help. After speaking, Charles Doyle turned and headed downstairs, with the others following him as he made his way to the second-floor terrace. Ginny reminded him, Boss, John and the others have already left. Charles smiled and said, I didn't say we're going to help John Wick. He's got the information he wanted, and I believe he can find the high table and meet the elder. Now, the one we need to help is not John Wick, but poor Beretta. Pushing open the door to the second-floor terrace, Charles Doyle looked at Beretta, who was still moaning on the ground, and shook his head in disapproval. It's really pitiful. You were just fine, but why did you shoot her dog in front of someone who loves dogs? The last guy who did something like this ended up dead, along with his own father. Seeing Charles and her group coming in, Beretta, in pain, asked, Charles, what are you here for? Do you want to? Although Beretta didn't finish his sentence, he had already prepared for the worst in his heart. Charles shook his head again and said, No, I'm not here to kill you. Seeing that Charles wasn't here to kill him, Beretta gritted his teeth and asked, the elder's address. Charles shook his head once more and said, I'm not looking for the elder yet, it's not time to meet with them. I'm here to help you. Charles looked at Beretta's leg, where there was a gunshot wound and another wound that he glanced at briefly. It hadn't fallen off, it was still there. The dog had shown some mercy, but the wound was about to break. Charles wondered if a wax bath would help. At this moment, Charles crouched down next to Beretta, whispered a few words in his ear, and saw Beretta nodding frantically, a glimmer of hope in his face. Charles then stood up and instructed Irika, take Mr. Beretta with you, be gentle, and go to the management lounge. Then, he turned to Rock Lee and Suzuki and said, you two, prepare a wax bath for him later. 52. Beretta's blood oath marker. Beretta spent the night in the wax bath, and his injuries were mostly healed by the time he stepped out. As he emerged from the bathtub, he marveled at the miraculous healing powers at Charles Doyle's disposal. Even his little brother's wounds had been repaired. It was a close call with that damn dog, almost getting his groin bitten off. The curative abilities of this wax bath were truly extraordinary. This was a valuable asset, especially for those in their line of work. Such a facility in a hotel would attract assassins from all over the world. The customer base and business would skyrocket. After all, even with bulletproof vests, there was no guarantee one wouldn't get injured. But thinking back to his ordeal from the previous day, Beretta shivered. Then, gritting his teeth, he called out, Sophia. Once dressed, Beretta stepped out and saw Charles Doyle in the living room. He immediately wore a smile on his face, warmly opening his arms to embrace Charles. Thank you, Charles. You saved my life. Though Charles hadn't actually saved his life, the help he had received was no less than life-saving, even greater than that. After all, as a man, losing that thing was sometimes more unacceptable than losing one's life. After a brief hug with Charles, Beretta spoke, I owe you a favor, Charles. What do you need me to do for you? Or should I give you one of my blood oath markers? Beretta had a sincere smile on his face as he looked earnestly at Charles. Charles smiled and didn't dismiss Beretta's goodwill. He said, since you're so sincere, then give me one of your blood oath markers. Although they were both blood oath markers, the effectiveness of a regular assassin's blood oath and one held by the manager of a continental hotel was not the same. Beretta didn't hesitate and walked to the bedroom. He retrieved a blank blood oath marker from the drawer and then came back to Charles. He pricked his finger and pressed his blood imprint onto the marker. After completing these actions, Beretta handed the blood oath marker to Charles. Charles accepted it without hesitation and put it in his pocket. Seeing Charles taking the blood oath marker, Beretta wore a smile again and asked, Charles, I wonder if there's a possibility of cooperation regarding this wax bath. After experiencing it, I believe it's a significant business opportunity. It's highly attractive to people in our profession. With this, even regular underground doctors would be out of work. Seeing the smile on Beretta's face, Charles knew he was interested, but he still refused, saying, Beretta, the timing isn't right yet. Discussing cooperation is a bit premature. Hearing that Charles didn't outright reject the idea, Beretta knew there was hope. He then suggested, Charles, I'll wait for your good news. When the time comes, I'll design a pricing structure that suits your needs. How about a combination of US dollars and gold coins, or an all-gold coin payment model? Looking at Beretta, who was already thinking about pricing, Charles smiled and said, we'll discuss this another time. Since you're fine now, I'll take my leave. Seeing Charles about to leave, Beretta didn't insist and thanked him once again before Charles exited. On the other side, Sophia was driving, and she had brought John Wick to the edge of the desert. Sophia stopped the car and opened the trunk, taking out a dog bowl and a large bottle of mineral water. She poured some water into the bowl and said to her two hounds, drink up. John Wick also got out of the car at this point. From his pocket, he took out Sophia's blood oath marker, but before he could say anything, he heard Sophia's ominous words. "You will die, John, maybe in this desert or somewhere else." Sophia paused for a moment, then looked at John Wick with certainty and said, "But you will die without a doubt." John Wick didn't say anything. He took a deep breath, opened the blood oath marker, pricked his finger, and pressed his fingerprint on the other side of the emblem. He then closed it and handed it to Sophia, saying, "Consequences." Sophia received the blood oath marker and also uttered, "Consequences." She then handed the nearly empty bottle of mineral water to John. Just as John was about to reach for it, Sophia evaded his hand. Instead, she poured the remaining water into her mouth right in front of him. John turned his head in resignation. However, Sophia didn't actually swallow the water, she rinsed her mouth with it angrily and then spat it all back into the bottle. She then put the bottle back in front of John and said, "Get on the road quickly." Seeing this revenge-driven woman in front of him, John Wick, considering the desert environment, accepted the bottle from her. Looking at the almost empty bottle, John called out her name with a sigh, "Sophia." Without further communication, John Wick started walking towards the desert. Meanwhile, at the Moroccan Continental Hotel, Charles Doyle, along with his team, reached the hotel's front desk and checked out. As they stepped out of the hotel, they headed in the direction of the desert. They drove until they reached the edge of the desert. Ginny asked, "Boss, it's easy to get lost in the desert. Where are we going next?" Charles didn't answer Ginny's question but instead turned to Irika and said, "Irika, fetch John Wick's shirt." Following Charles's order, Irika retrieved a blood-stained shirt from the luggage and placed it in front of Charles. Charles then bit his finger and formed seals with both hands, saying, "Summoning Jutsu." Bang! A burst of smoke dissipated, revealing a ninja dog in front of everyone. Irika and the others remained unfazed. They were familiar with summoning Jutsu, and they could use it too, thanks to the system. For them, summoning animals was a standard ability for all ninja participating in battles. Ginny, on the other hand, was astonished. She couldn't believe her eyes as she witnessed Charles, after performing some hand seals, summoned an animal, a dog of all things. Parker glanced around, assessed the situation, and then asked, "Lord Charles, is there something you need me to do?" Ginny pointed at Parker and exclaimed, "The dog is talking. The dog is actually talking." 53. Preparing for action. Upon hearing the woman's words, Parker, with a displeased tone, said, "Madam, I'm a ninja dog." "It's perfectly normal for ninja dogs to speak," Charles added. Ginny, with a look of disbelief, retorted, "Dog speaking is not normal." Ginny, realizing that she was the last to know, glanced at Charles with a somewhat resentful look. Seeing Ginny's resentful gaze, Charles chuckled and said, "I'm a ninja, I know a bit of ninja techniques and a bit of summoning jutsu. Isn't that reasonable?" Ginny was tempted to shout out, "Is that really reasonable?" Charles didn't tease Ginny any further and said, "We'll discuss it later. Let's focus on the task at hand." Charles took John's shirt and asked the summoned dog, "Parker, can you find the owner of this shirt?" Parker approached, sniffed the shirt, then sniffed the direction of the desert, and replied, "The scent is clear, the target is moving, but the movement is very slow." Charles, after a moment of thought, said, "Parker, please keep tracking John. Once he stops moving and a considerable amount of time passes, and then when he starts moving again, notify me. However, it might take a while, it could be 2 or 3 days." Charles remembered that John Wick had walked in the desert until he collapsed and was then taken away by the Elder's people. Given John Wick's endurance, he wouldn't collapse in less than 2 days, even in the desert. Factoring in the journey from Casablanca to New York and back, he might be in the desert for 2 or 3 days. Parker, puzzled, asked, "Is there a reason we're not pursuing him right now?" Charles shook his head, "If we catch up with him now, John Wick won't meet the Elder of the High Table. Let's rest in the car for now. Once he meets the Elder, with our speed, we'll be able to catch up quickly." Hearing Charles's explanation, the team had no objections and decided to wait. Parker, bored, hopped onto the front of the car and occasionally sniffed John's scent. Meanwhile, Rock Lee and Suzuki exercised, Irika kept watch, and Charles began explaining to Ginny what a true ninja was. Sunrise and sunset came and went, and 3 days quickly passed. In New York, it was pouring rain. The Bowery King sat in his internet center, letting the rain soak him. He held a pigeon in his arms and caressed it with a lonely expression. Several of the adjudicator's subordinates surrounded him, watching him closely. Below, in their base, a massacre was unfolding. Zero, accompanied by his disciples, relentlessly slaughtered the Bowery King's subordinates. None of them posed a challenge, and none could halt their rampage. Whether it was with cold weapons or firearms, none of the Bowery King's men could harm them. The battle continued until the Bowery King's base was completely devoid of life. On the rooftop, the Bowery King saw the adjudicator's agents approaching under umbrellas. He got up and walked towards them, saying, "All right, you've made your point. You've won my loyalty." Unable to contact Charles Doyle due to the circumstances, the Bowery King's men were powerless against the adjudicator of the high table. Coupled with the massacre carried out by the adjudicator's agents, he decided to surrender. "In fact, I'd like to stuff a lot of loyalty up your rear end, so much that it'll come out of your mouth," the adjudicator agent replied. The agent stared directly at the Bowery King and said, "I've given you a chance." Evidently, the agent wasn't interested in the Bowery King's loyalty, instead, he was resolute in his decision. Realizing that surrender and loyalty were ineffective, the Bowery King muttered resentfully, "Since you think that way, I guess it's time to tell you to get off your high table and die." Unfazed by the Bowery King's trash talk, the adjudicator agent replied, "I heard you. You gave John Wick 7 bullets, you will atone with 7 blades." The Bowery King, upon hearing that it was 7 blades rather than an immediate death sentence, inexplicably relaxed and said, "Sometimes, you just have to cut some bastards a few times." After speaking, he glanced at his killer, Zero, and covered the pigeon's eyes in his hand, saying, "Don't look, my dear." Then, he turned to the adjudicator agent and said, "The old king is dead." He released the white dove from his hand and walked over to Zero, saying, "Long live the new king." Zero didn't hesitate and immediately slashed at the Bowery King 7 times. Swish, swish, swish. After the 7 swift slashes, the Bowery King let out a pitiful cry and fell to the ground. The adjudicator agent, after taking a brief look at the fallen Bowery King, left with his subordinates. The judgment had been carried out, and from now on, the Bowery King was no longer the ruler of the Bowery. After everyone had left, Erla climbed to the rooftop, looking at the severely injured Bowery King, as she carried him away from the scene. "Lord Charles, John Wick's aura has been stationary for some time." Parker approached Charles and reported the situation. Charles stretched his muscles. They had been stationed at the edge of the desert for 3 days. While his system backpack provided them with food and water, the endless sea of sand was still incredibly dull. "Are we finally going to meet the Elder of the High Table?" Charles mused. "Parker, let me know when he starts moving," Charles instructed. "Everyone, get ready, we're about to set out." Upon hearing that they were going to take action, the team perked up, shaking off their fatigue. Ginny began inspecting her firearms and ammunition. In the desert, where sandstorms were common, she hadn't taken her weapons out of their cases in the past few days to prevent sand from getting inside and potentially jamming her guns. Her firearms had undergone special modifications and required more careful maintenance. On the other hand, Irika and Suzuki, besides Rock Lee, took out their ninja tool pouches and checked their kunai, shuriken, and explosive tags. As for Charles Doyle, due to the capabilities of his system space, he didn't need to perform any checks. With a thought, he could purchase explosive tags and ninja tools directly from the system's store, and they would instantly appear in his hands. John Wick had been unconscious in the desert for a long time, showing no signs of waking. At this moment, an Arab man appeared on the sand dune, leading a camel. He looked down at the fallen man and approached him, lifting him onto the camel's back before heading off into the distance. Parker sensed the change in the aura and immediately reported, "Lord Charles, John Wick's aura has started moving again." Charles waved his hand and declared, "Let's go." 54, your conditions aren't as good as his. The Arab man used a camel to carry John Wick and walked all the way to a gathering point in the desert. Upon arriving at their destination, he simply let John Wick fall off the camel. At this point, John was completely unconscious, and even falling off the camel failed to wake him. The Arab man dragged John Wick into the largest pavilion in the gathering area and waited. On the other side of the desert, Parker, who had been running at high speed, suddenly spoke up, "Charles, John's scent has stopped moving again." Charles Doyle, who was driving the SUV, knew that John had reached the location of the Elder. Seeing the slow progress of the car in the desert, Charles slammed on the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a stop. He then said, "Get out of the car, we'll make a dash for it. Driving in the desert is too slow. He didn't want John Wick to lose a finger due to their slow arrival. After all, John was now under his command. Upon hearing Charles's orders, Irika, Suzuki, and Rock Lee had no objections. They simply opened the car doors and jumped out. Ginny, however, was a bit puzzled. She looked at Charles with a questioning expression, wondering why they were abandoning the car. After all, a car was faster than human speed. Seeing Ginny's confusion, Charles instructed, Parker, lead the way, full speed ahead. In the blink of an eye, Parker's figure appeared far ahead. In just a few seconds, he had covered a significant distance, moving much faster than the SUV. Irika, Suzuki, and Rock Lee followed closely behind Parker, never falling behind. Seeing this, Ginny gained a new understanding of ninja abilities. Observing Ginny still standing there dazed, Charles bent slightly and said, Climb onto my back, you're too slow. I'll carry you while running. Ginny didn't hesitate and jumped onto Charles's back, wrapping her legs tightly around his waist and her arms around his neck. Feeling the softness on his back, Charles said gently, Hold on tight, I'm going to accelerate. Without waiting for Ginny's response, Charles sprinted at full speed, catching up to the three ahead of them with a few leaps. Ginny watched the rapidly receding scenery and tightened her thighs. She was afraid that if she let go, she would fall off Charles's back. Seeing that Charles had caught up, Parker said, We're still quite a distance away, I'm going to speed up. Can all of you keep up? Charles glanced at the three of them and then said, Maintain your strength and chakra, and keep up the pace. We'll engage in combat as soon as we arrive. Yes. X3. With their confirmation, Parker accelerated once again. John lay on a carpet, the sunlight shining on his face, and he slowly began to wake up. Drink up. Hearing the voice by his ear, John Wick immediately looked towards his gun, which was on his waist. Don't worry, your weapons are still with you. Have some water. Hearing these words, John Wick gradually regained his senses and looked towards the source of the voice. Sitting in front of him was a man with dark skin, dressed in an Arabian style, yet exuding an air of grandeur. John slowly sat up and picked up the water glass in front of him, about to take a sip. The man in front of him spoke again, Kid, why have you become so lost? John faced the man and said, I'm not lost, I'm looking for you. You think I'm giving you directions to your location? The man's tone was cryptic. John didn't answer immediately but slowly drank the water from the glass. He was incredibly thirsty. I have never seen anyone fight so hard to escape the world of killing, only to voluntarily return to square one, the elder said as he rose and approached John Wick. He squatted down and looked at John, asking, Why do you want to stay alive? Hearing this familiar question, John Wick didn't hesitate with his response, but in his heart, he was thinking, Charles, I've met the elder now. Where are you guys? Can you make it in time? For my wife, Helen. To remember her, to remember us. Upon hearing John's reply, the elder asked again, So, do you want to live for the sake of the memories of love? John's voice was low as he answered, At least I want one chance to fight for it. The elder gazed at the man before him, seeking life, and said, I can give you one last chance to earn your life. However, what you earn may not be the life you envisioned. You will be allowed to continue living, but you cannot break free from the control of the high table, you will be bound by it. Use your remaining days to do what you excel at. Hearing the conditions presented by the elder, John Wick remained composed on the surface but was secretly thinking, I've already completed my mission, which is to meet you. The excommunicado will be revoked, the bounty will be cancelled, not because of you but because of Charles. Most importantly, he won't need to be under the high table's restraint, he just has to pledge loyalty to Charles. Elder, your terms aren't as favorable as Charles's. The elder obviously didn't know John's inner thoughts. He got up and returned to his chair, saying, Of course, the choice is yours. Die here and now, or live at the cost of death, clinging to the past. Hearing the elder's question of whether he wanted to live now or die, John Wick slowly stood up. He glanced around but couldn't find any trace of Charles and the others. He could only face the elder and asked, What do you want me to do? At this moment, the elder's voice turned stern as he said, You must use your life to exchange for another's death, the first target being Winston. John was puzzled, What? The elder explained, He has forgotten his oath of loyalty. The public bounty and excommunication won't be lifted until you complete the task. So, if you want to live and remember the past, this is the choice you must make. John Wick slowly lowered his head. He hadn't expected that the Elder's condition would be to kill Winston, the man who had helped him escape. Without Winston, he wouldn't have been able to leave the Continental Hotel, and he certainly wouldn't have had that precious extra hour to reach Charles's agency. Looking at the serious expression of the Elder, John had no choice but to pretend to agree. He knew that if he didn't agree now, he might not survive the next moment. Kneeling down on one knee, John Wick slowly said, "I will serve the high table, offering my life in service, my death in loyalty." Upon hearing John's response, the Elder smiled and said, "Very well, my child. Cast away your weakness and reaffirm your loyalty to the high table." At this point, the Elder's two subordinates carried a small table and placed it in front of John Wick. On the table were two items, a shovel and a wooden mallet. John stared at the two items on the table, deep in thought. The Elder slowly said, "Mr. John Wick, I would like to see it." "Show it to me." John, realizing that the Elder was asking him to cut off a finger as a sign of loyalty, wondered if Charles's wax bath could reattach fingers. He thought, "Charles, if you don't appear soon, your subordinate will become a disabled person." As he looked around and saw no changes in the surroundings, John Wick pondered for a moment, then picked up the shovel from the table, about to make his choice. Swish, 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 swish. Several throwing knives flew in, directly killing the guards standing around. Seeing this sudden turn of events, John Wick heaved a sigh of relief. He picked up the shovel and hurled it with all his might at a guard in the courtyard who was about to draw his gun. 55. Slaughter, Bonus Chapter. Explosions resounded, and dozens of kunai, each bearing explosive tags, rained down from the sky, targeting various tents within the gathering area and causing chaos. Irika, Naruto, Sasuke, and Jinny were on the offensive, leaving no room for survivors. Even Parker, although not the primary attacker among the summoning beasts, was swatting enemies aside with ease. As a ninja hound, his explosive power was no joke. Charles observed the situation and saw armed gunmen emerging from a large tent. He started performing hand seals. Fire release, Great Fireball Jutsu. Gathering an enormous amount of chakra in his chest, Charles expelled it toward the tent. A massive fireball, over 10 meters in diameter and crimson in color, formed instantaneously and hurtled toward the tent at breakneck speed. The tent was instantly set ablaze, and the gunmen inside, unable to escape in time, were consumed by the flames, meeting a fiery demise. Seeing the remarkable effectiveness of the fire release jutsu, Charles wasted no time and released 5 more Great Fireball Jutsu in succession, turning the entire gathering area into an inferno. Witnessing Charles's use of ninjutsu, Uchiha Sasuke also activated his Sharingan. Lightning release, Chidori. Sasuke's hand crackled with lightning, and he sprinted like a bolt of lightning itself. With a cacophony of thunderous chirping birds, he killed any enemy in his path. In one fell swoop, he took down over a dozen foes. Rock Lee, on the other hand, engaged in his infinite dance technique. He sent several enemies flying into the air, only for them to plummet lifelessly back to the ground, incapacitated by the impact. Lee's attacks were so precise that one touch meant certain death. Only Irika was different, holding a kunai and dealing with enemies by swiftly and skillfully targeting their necks. For the ninjas, these adversaries were exceptionally weak. Despite wearing bulletproof vests, their gear offered little protection against the ninja squad. Even their vests couldn't withstand the barrage of kunai and other attacks. In the entire battlefield, Jinny might have been the closest to a normal enemy. If one overlooked her shooting skills and her bullets that curved like a boomerang, she would indeed seem quite regular. In essence, Charles's team consisted solely of extraordinary individuals, and there wasn't a single regular person among them. Before long, the Elder's henchmen had been defeated, with only a few stragglers remaining, unable to put up effective resistance. Charles entered the tent where John Wick was being held. As he stepped inside, he saw John Wick pointing his gun at an Arab man seated in a chair. "John, I told you that as long as you find the Elder, we'll be here on time. I didn't disappoint you, did I?" Charles smiled calmly. John Wick replied in a calm tone, "Boss, your strength is indeed impressive. You saved one of my fingers just in time." Charles knew that if he had arrived just a few seconds later, John Wick's index finger would have been history, permanently. Approaching the Arab man who sat in the chair, Charles said, I presume this gentleman is one of the 12 controllers of the High Table, one of the elders. As he spoke, the gunfire outside grew fainter until it ceased entirely. Following the screams, there were no more sounds of gunshots or bullets being fired. The elder, seated in the chair, remained composed and asked, I recognize you, Charles Doyle, a legendary assassin in the underworld, and you've even earned the title of #1 hitman recently. Are you planning to betray the High Table? To this question from the High Table elder, Charles wore a faint smile and replied, No, it's not betrayal, but my aim is to become one of the High Table's elders, to gain one of the 12 seats. How can you call that betrayal? Due to John Wick's vigilant watch, the elder was unaware of how Charles and his team had annihilated his henchmen. He assumed they had brought reinforcements. Then he shook his head and said, Charles, you should know that these people outside aren't the true power of the High Table, and they aren't even my full strength. It's impossible to gain one of the 12 seats by slaughtering them. Charles smiled and replied, You don't need to worry about that. What you need to do is take us to the real headquarters of the High Table. Clearly, Charles didn't believe that this outpost was the true headquarters of the High Table. A campsite with no defenses, exposed tents, and just a pavilion. Could this really be the High Table's headquarters? Just as the elder was about to speak, Ginny, Irika, and the others walked in one after another. The elder looked at everyone and then considered his own situation. He spoke, I can take you to the headquarters, but you must not harm me. Seeing that the elder, who had yet to be tortured, was willing to lead them back to the headquarters, Charles thought to himself, interesting. All right, we won't harm you. Just take us to the High Table's headquarters. You need to convene a high-level meeting. The elder slowly got up, walked out of the building, and looked outside. His gaze fell on the raging flames, collapsed tents, and craters left by the explosions. He then turned to Charles, puzzled, and asked, Did you come with just 5 people? He had gathered nearly 200 subordinates here, and while they didn't have heavy weapons, they had plenty of handguns and rifles. Killing 200 sheep shouldn't have been this quick with just 5 people, right? Charles smiled and replied, It's not just 5 of us, there's also a ninja dog. At this point, Parker also walked in and said, Lord Charles, I rounded up several panicked camels and brought them back. You might need these for transportation later. Not only the elder but even John Wick stared in astonishment at the talking ninja dog. After all, John had seen Charles walking the dog before. He had met him because he saw Charles walking his dog. But John Wick knew that now was not the time to dwell on these matters. Upon hearing Parker's words, Charles thanked him, saying, Thank you for your hard work, Parker. There shouldn't be any immediate danger here. You can return for now. Parker replied, If you need me, please summon me at any time. With a bang, Parker disappeared in a puff of smoke, right before the eyes of everyone present. At this moment, the elder's pupils contracted. This scene was even more surprising than a talking dog, and it made him realize that there was more to Charlotte than met the eye. He turned back and gave Charlotte a deep look before saying, The journey ahead may be long. Everyone, follow me. 56, Breaking Through. The elder rode on a camel, leading Charles and the others to the true headquarters of the High Table. Meanwhile, Ginny handed Charles a camera. This was a task he had given her on their way here, to document some of the carnage they were about to unleash. Recording these events was not only to showcase their strength to the 12 elders of the High Table, who hailed from different countries and regions, but also to prove that he was worthy to become one of the High Table's leaders. On the way, the elder willingly provided information to Charles, revealing details about the permanent armed forces stationed at the headquarters and the presence of another elder inside. Since Charles aimed to become one of the leaders of the High Table, it meant that one of the current leaders had to step down for the new one to ascend. This elder had no intention of dying, especially after witnessing Charles's incredible abilities and mastery of the summoning arts. So, he saw an opportunity to align with Charles for his own benefit. As for the lives lost among his own men, he could only silently apologize to them. On the other side, the New York Continental Hotel. Since John Wick hadn't pledged loyalty to the elder or accepted any missions, the adjudicator had not received any orders regarding him. After dealing with the Bowery King, the adjudicator came directly to the Continental Hotel. Entering Winston's lounge, the adjudicator walked up to Winston, her expression icy. Have you decided to step down? Winston looked at the adjudicator, his expression solemn. I do not agree. Since John Wick hadn't returned and couldn't come to his aid, Winston had already gathered a group of assassins who were willing to follow his orders. While they might not be as formidable as John Wick, their numbers were significant, especially considering that most of the assassins in the New York area were willing to support him. This gave Winston the courage to reject the adjudicator. Hearing Winston's refusal to step down, the adjudicator coldly responded, "Very well." She then turned and pulled out her phone, making a call to the High Tables administration. "I'd like to modify an order. Adjudicator 101-1979, New York Continental Hotel, excommunicado." After hearing the confirmation that the New York Continental Hotel had been successfully excommunicated, the adjudicator hung up and turned back to Winston. "Winston, the organization has officially excommunicated you. The Continental Hotel is no longer safe for you." She continued, "The High Tables envoys will arrive shortly to erase you from this building. Good night, Winston." With those final words, the adjudicator left without looking back. Winston muttered to himself as he watched the adjudicator depart, the Continental Hotel, no longer a sanctuary. He then took out his phone and contacted Karen, saying, "The conflict with the High Table has begun." With that, Winston ended the call and headed to his weapons cache and safe room within the Continental Hotel. Soon after, a broadcast echoed throughout the Continental Hotel, announcing its closure for fumigation. The message apologized for any inconvenience and instructed everyone to proceed to the nearest exit. Back in the hotel's lobby, the adjudicator approached Zero and his disciples, who were seated on the couch. "Now, you can carry out your tasks with your disciples within the Continental Hotel." Before leaving, the adjudicator reminded Zero once more, "We will send some of our best operatives to provide additional support." Zero smiled and replied, "Very well, that's excellent." Afterwards, the adjudicator returned to her room, awaiting the outcome of her decision. Shortly thereafter, 2 armored buses stopped outside the hotel's entrance, and dozens of heavily armed assassins, wearing bulletproof helmets and outfits, disembarked. They carried firearms and organized themselves into tactical formations before entering the Continental Hotel. At this moment, the slaughter within the hotel officially commenced. On the other side, Charles and the others, riding camels, followed the elder as they arrived at the headquarters of the High Table. The location was in the heart of the desert, and the High Table's headquarters weren't on the surface but underground. It was unclear how they had found this place in the desert suitable for constructing underground facilities. Upon entering the High Table's headquarters with the elder, Charles immediately gave the order to kill. They pushed forward ruthlessly, killing anyone they encountered, with the intention of reaching the administrative area. The elder stayed behind Charles and the others, guiding them without the slightest realization that he had led the enemy to the headquarters. Charles and the group pushed forward, using ninjutsu, shurikens, explosive tags, and various other techniques without holding back. The result was that neither John Wick nor Ginny had to shoot more than a few people before the battle ended. It was only at this moment that the elder, who had followed behind them the whole way, truly realized the horrifying power of Charles Doyle and his subordinates. He recognized that Charles's strength was more than sufficient to become one of the High Table's elders, and he felt justified in choosing to align himself with his faction. After a spree of killings, the elder led Charles and the others to an outer safe house of the High Table's headquarters. This was the last line of defense for the High Table. At this moment, another High Table elder was hiding inside, and he had already notified others outside, calling for reinforcements as the High Table's headquarters came under attack. Looking at the massive metal door in front of them, Charles smiled and said, "Irika, break it with a sealing formation." Hearing Charles's command, Irika walked up to the door and started to set up explosive tags. 1, 2, 5, 10 tags, and finally, it took a total of 30 tags to set up the sealing formation. Irika had arranged the explosive tags in such a way that their power was simultaneously ignited and focused in one place. Boom! With a tremendous explosion, the metal door was blown apart, leaving it wide open for them to pass through. Inside the safe house, the Black Elder saw that the last line of defense had also fallen and decided to surrender. Seeing the group entering, he spoke first, "I know you, Charles Doyle. What do you want, and why did you attack the High Table's headquarters? And you, Mark Tom, why did you betray the High Table?" Charles had no interest in answering the questions of the Black Elder and no desire to engage in conversation. He simply threw a shuriken, ending the Elder's life. Then, turning to the Elder by his side, he said, "Elder, please prepare a meeting of the High Table's elders. 57, who's in favor, who's against?" Seeing Charles swiftly kill the Black Elder, Mark Tom gained a deeper understanding of him. Charles seemed to have no desire to communicate with anyone. Without hesitation, Mark Tom spoke, "Everyone, follow me." After that, Mark Tom led the way out of the safe house, taking the group to a conference room on the negative third floor. The conference room was spacious, with a large electronic screen in front. Mark Tom approached the control panel and operated it, causing the screen to light up in front of everyone. The screen was divided into 12 sections, each corresponding to one of the seats on the high table. Soon, the video connections were established, and the images of the elders appeared on the screen. Out of the 12 sections, 11 were lit up, and the only one that remained dark was the section previously held by the Black Elder that Charles Doyle had killed. The images of Charles and the group also appeared on the screen, allowing the 10 elders outside to see the situation in the conference room. Mark Tom saw that most of the members were present and began, "Everyone, today marks the most significant change in the history of the High Table. For this reason, I have called for the highest High Table meeting." The elders behind the screen had now learned about the events unfolding at headquarters. Although they didn't have the exact details, they had a general idea of what had occurred. The elders' expressions varied at this moment. One of the Russian elders spoke, "Mark Tom, a meeting is certainly necessary, but shouldn't you explain the attack on headquarters first? I believe you all have received Morse's distress message." As for why Mark Tom didn't mention where Morse was, the elders looked at the screen representing the headquarters and noticed Morse's absence. They understood that Morse was likely deceased, but they didn't know whether it was due to a clash between two elders or some other reason. While they were all high table controllers, internal conflicts and power struggles were still present from the outset. They weren't originally a single faction but a collection of multiple factions. Mark Tom didn't answer immediately but turned his gaze to Charles Doyle, seeking guidance on how to respond to this question. Charles, seeing Martham's inquiring look, calmly spoke, "Ginny, upload the recorded footage from earlier to the projection." Ginny took out the SD card from the camera and uploaded the video recordings from today to the computer. She then started the playback. Soon, the elders saw the video recordings of Charles and the group breaking into the stronghold today. In the footage, Charles and the others were wreathed in flames, surrounded by lightning, demonstrating incredible speed, strength, and explosive paper tags. Every element of the video conveyed their exceptional abilities. Charles stepped forward and addressed the elders on the screen, saying, "The things you see in these videos, I believe you understand what they represent." At this moment, the elders on the screen looked at Charles Doyle with different eyes. Although Morse had informed them that Mark Tom, accompanied by Charles and his group, had attacked headquarters, he hadn't transmitted the video footage of the attack. It wasn't that Morse didn't want to share it, but he simply didn't have the time. I, Charles Doyle, a registered member of the New York Continental Hotel, a legendary assassin, now apply to become one of the 12 seats on the high table. As soon as the words were spoken, the elders on the screen exchanged glances. One of the Asian elders spoke up, "Charles, I am aware of your situation. With your abilities, you are qualified to become an elder. But I'd like to ask if you are willing to share your abilities, including that explosive paper that's comparable to hand grenades." Hearing this, the other elders on the screen showed interest. Indeed, Charles's abilities, while diverse, seemed to be part of a cohesive system. It appeared that Charles had established a systematic way of training ninja skills. As they operated in the shadows, those involved with the high table were more inclined to accept and believe in the existence of mysterious and esoteric knowledge. Upon hearing someone inquire about his ninja techniques and explosive tags, Charles smiled. He knew that the elders were attracted not only to the flashy and powerful ninja skills but also to the portable explosive tags. These small pieces of paper possessed tremendous explosive power and were easily concealed, making them incredibly convenient for anyone seeking to cause havoc. Unfortunately, Charles couldn't share these abilities at the moment. Even the explosive tags couldn't be used without chakra, and he currently didn't have the power to grant others chakra, as he wasn't the six paths. Charles's smile remained as he spoke, "Whether it's ninja techniques or explosive tags, I cannot provide them to you. Even if I could, you wouldn't be able to use them. However, since I intend to become one of the controllers of the high table, I will bring benefits to the organization. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Wax Bath from the Assassin Brotherhood." When the elders heard the mention of the Assassin Brotherhood, they became intrigued. This organization was invited to join in the early days of the high table, but they had declined that offer at that time and chose remain alone. However, considering the recent reports that Charles had annihilated the Assassin Brotherhood. One of the elders asked, "The wax bath, is it that legendary substance that can rapidly heal injuries?" Clearly, this elder had some knowledge about the Brotherhood's secrets. Hearing someone's recognition of the wax bath, Charles revealed a smile. He briefly explained the benefits of the wax bath and continued, "I will establish recovery chambers primarily based on the wax bath, gradually, within the continental hotels controlled by each of you, to help assassins recover from injuries. As for pricing and revenue sharing arrangements, we can discuss those details later." Charles's voice turned dominant as he asked, "Now, regarding my request to become one of the 12 seats on the high table, who supports it, and who opposes it?" Charles was making his stance clear, and it was now up to the high table elders to decide how they would vote. Standing beside Charles, Mark Tom spoke first. "Elder Morse has tragically passed away, leaving one seat vacant. I support Mr. Charles becoming a high table elder." Hearing Martham's words, the other elders behind the screen began to express their support one after another. In the end, not a single one opposed the motion. 58. The new elder, Charles Doyle. Hearing that there was no opposition, Charles Doyle was somewhat surprised. In his imagination, there should have been at least one or two dissenting voices or abstentions among the elders, right? Yet it had gone so smoothly. It was clear that the elders saw greater value in Charles Doyle. After all, he was not an outsider, he was a member of the Continental Hotels under the High Table, essentially part of the High Table. With a vacant seat and a willing candidate, it made sense to proceed. Furthermore, with the wax bath's magical properties, the elders wouldn't lose out. Once they get to know each other better, they could potentially obtain explosive tags or learn ninja techniques from Charles, which would be quite profitable. Of course, the most important aspect was the fear of retaliation. If they opposed or abstained, what if this guy held a grudge? Given his ability to breach the headquarters, it meant that if they were found, their bases could also be breached. They weren't fools, they understood that though it was unfortunate for Morse's family not being able to inherit his position, but they had to prioritize their own safety. Seeing that everyone unanimously agreed to Charles Doyle becoming the new high table elder, Mark Tom wore a friendly smile and said, "Mr. Charles, we will quickly arrange for your corresponding status and proof of authority. We will also inform all the subordinate factions under the high table of your new status. I wonder if you'd like to take over Morse's territory, or do you have other plans?" At this point, the many elders behind the screen turned their serious gazes towards Charles Doyle. The division of power was crucial, and each of them had their own jurisdiction. While members of the high table received preferential treatment everywhere, and even their adjudicators could mobilize the subordinate factions in different regions, the territorial divisions were non-negotiable. Charles looked at Mark Tom and asked, "Whose territory does the Continental Hotel in USA fall under?" When they heard Charles inquire about USA, the elders behind the screen maintained their composure, as this didn't concern them. Mark Tom had anticipated this and replied with a smile, "It falls under my jurisdiction. If Elder Charles needs it, I'll gladly give up that territory." Charles responded, "You can have Morse's legacy, including the area he was responsible for, as a token in exchange for USA. Charles's willingness to do this surprised Mark Tom. He had expected a significant loss, but it turned out to be quite a profitable deal. He promptly said, "Thank you, Mr. Charles. After organizing Morse's assets, we will present you with a generous gift." With everything settled, the high table's meeting came to a close. At this moment, John Wick, who had been silent since he entered, spoke up, "My Lord Charles, the adjudicators of the high table have already arrived in New York. I'm not sure about Winston's situation." Evidently, the task that Mark Tom had assigned to him earlier had alerted him about the trouble on Winston's end. Upon hearing John Wick's plea, Charles turned to the nearby elders and said, "Please temporarily halt the adjudicators' actions, as I requested." Mark Tom had no objections. After all, New York was now under Charles's control. He took out his phone and dialed a number. At the Continental Hotel in New York. Without John Wick's support, Winston couldn't resist the Envoys and Zero's assassins. The Envoys were equipped with advanced gear, and Winston's men couldn't put up much of a fight. They suffered heavy casualties, especially against Zero and his apprentices, who were unstoppable without much resistance. At this point, the high table's envoys had already entered Winston's safe house and were about to pass final judgment on him. "Winston, no one can defy the will of the high table. Going against the high table, breaking the rules, it won't work for you, you don't have that capability. As Winston looked at the arrogant and domineering envoys, he sighed and admitted defeat. Without John Wick as the sharp edge of his defense, his men couldn't withstand the High Table's envoys. Just as the adjudicator was about to order her subordinates to pass the final judgment, her phone rang. Taking out her phone, she saw the caller ID and immediately stepped away a few paces before respectfully answering the call. "Hello, Elder. How may I assist you?" Hearing that it was the Elder on the other end of the line, Winston regained a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was still a chance for things to turn around. "Elder, we haven't carried out the judgment yet, he's still alive." "Yes, understood, I'll inform them." After hanging up the phone, the adjudicator turned back to face Winston, gazing at him as she said, "Winston, you're quite lucky. The Elder has decided to spare your life. Furthermore, the new High Table Elder will arrive in a few days. You need to prepare and host a banquet. At that time, the heads of all the American factions under the High Table will pledge their loyalty to the new Elder." The adjudicator then disregarded Winston and gave her orders, "Retreat and wait with me for the arrival of the High Table Elder." With that, the adjudicator left Winston's safe house along with the High Table's envoys and Zero's team. Winston stared blankly at the departing adjudicator. A sense of having narrowly escaped disaster washed over him. He didn't understand why the Elder had suddenly ordered a halt, but for him, it was a stroke of good fortune. As for hosting a banquet for the new Elder and preparing to receive him, Winston couldn't help but feel puzzled. Could it be that John Wick had established a relationship with the new Elder while in Casablanca? Winston looked at the hotel, which was in ruins. He muttered to himself, "Since I've survived, it's time to get to work." Meanwhile, on the other side. After ending the call, Mark Tom said, "The adjudicator has stopped her actions. Winston is not in mortal danger. Mr. Charles, I have already instructed them to prepare a grand banquet in New York for you. At that time, all the American factions under the High Table will come to pledge their loyalty to you and the High Table once again. As for Mr. John Wick's expulsion, that will be revoked shortly, and the bounties on him will also be lifted." Hearing Martham's words, Charles Doyle nodded in satisfaction and said, "Thank you for your hard work. I will designate the Continental Hotel in Morocco as one of the first hotels to have a wax bath recovery room. As for the cleanup of headquarters here, I'll leave it to you. We'll head back to New York for now." Upon hearing that Charles Doyle was leaving, Mark Tom approached him warmly and said, "I look forward to our next meeting, Mr. Charles." 59. Power Transition. From the moment Charles Doyle helped Beretta, a week had passed, and it had been 3 days since gaining recognition from the High Table. During this week, Charles Doyle had accumulated various rewards through the system: 1 ninjutsu scroll, 10 soul gems, 50 servings of delicious ramen, 400 reputation, 50,000 copper coins, 1 ninja recruitment scroll, and 1 ninjutsu scroll. Charles and his group chartered a plane and successfully arrived in New York from Casablanca. As they disembarked the plane, they noticed 3 Rolls-Royces waiting for them. The adjudicator stood beside one of the cars, holding a black umbrella, and waited. When Charles Doyle descended from the plane, the adjudicator stepped forward and said, "Please, Elder Charles, get into the car." Charles nodded and, along with Ginny, got into the same car. The other 4 members of their group each entered one of the remaining 2 Rolls-Royces. The cars quickly left the airport. Inside the car, the adjudicator took out a briefcase and opened it, placing it in front of Charles Doyle. She began explaining, "These are the gold coins representing your status as an elder, sent by the High Table, along with your identity verification card and adjudicator coins. There are 2 elder status gold coins in total. If you ever need to visit any faction under the High Table's control, presenting the elder coin will grant you the utmost service. This identity verification card contains your exclusive code. You will need it to confirm your identity when issuing instructions to the High Table's information center. Whether it's expulsion, retirement, bounties, or any other tasks, you can carry out these operations using your identity. Here are 9 adjudicator coins. You can assign them to your subordinates to become part of your adjudicators. The adjudicator's identity information needs to be uploaded to the Archives Center for identity confirmation. According to High Table rules, an elder can only have up to 9 adjudicators, but there are no quantity restrictions for other envoys and subordinates." After the adjudicator finished explaining, Charles Doyle took one of the gold coins that represented his elder status, examined it in his hand, and found it to be finely crafted. He then pocketed one coin and said, "Ginny, put these items away." Ginny received the briefcase from the adjudicator and placed it beside her. The adjudicator then proceeded to take out another briefcase filled with documents. Elder, these documents fall into 3 categories. The first category is deeds and properties. Elder Mark Tom has transferred all his assets, including properties, estates, training bases, armories, and more across the United States to you. Regarding real estate, there's 1 property in each of the 50 states in the United States, all established as safe houses. Hearing the adjudicator's words, Charles Doyle couldn't help but feel surprised, though he maintained a calm demeanor. Mark Tom had promised him a generous gift before leaving, but this exceeded his expectations. Mark Tom had indeed been generous, and it wasn't in vain that Charles spared his life. Seeing Charles Doyle's composed reaction, the adjudicator couldn't help but be surprised. Charles had gone from being an assassin to an elder, a transformation that was indeed extraordinary. Charles Doyle continued to listen as the adjudicator explained the contents of the documents. The second set of documents contains information about the high table envoys stationed in New York, including their names and detailed profiles. There are approximately 80 of them, used for maintaining the high table's interests across the United States. These individuals are a gift from Elder Mark Tom, and they are loyal to the high table and, now, to you. They have pledged to never betray. Hearing that Mark Tom had left him with a group of disposable assets, Charles Doyle nodded and said, Elder Mark Tom has been considerate. Charles didn't mind this force, it could be useful for maintaining high table order and interests. He'd accept them as subordinates, as he couldn't expect Irika and others to handle everything. As for concerns about their loyalty or leaking information, Charles wasn't worried. They weren't part of his core team and had limited contact with him. Continuing with her explanation, the adjudicator said, the third set of documents contains information and introductions to various factions under the high table across the United States. Elder Charles, due to being an underground force, some relatively weaker factions experience frequent changes in their leadership and influence. So, it will be your secretary's responsibility to regularly update the information in the High Table Archives Center. Seeing the adjudicator finish explaining the contents of the briefcase, Charles smiled and replied, all right, I will arrange for them to handle the information updates. Ginny, please take care of these items. You will be responsible for these matters from now on. Yes, boss. Ginny didn't hesitate and received the briefcase from the adjudicator, closing it and placing it beside her. The adjudicator extended her hand towards Charles and said, congratulations, Mr. Charles Doyle, on becoming one of the high table's elders. Charles shook her hand and replied, thank you. I'm curious about your plans now. Will you be permanently stationed in New York, or? The adjudicator responded, Elder Charles, after hosting your banquet event, I will return to Elder Mark Tom and follow his subsequent instructions. Your banquet will take place tomorrow afternoon, and I will arrange for a driver to pick you up. The event will be held at the Continental Hotel in New York. At that time, leaders from various factions under the high table in the United States will come to show their loyalty and offer their blessings. Charles was very satisfied with the high table's arrangements and felt respected and valued. He smiled and said, all right, thank you for your efforts. I'll leave the banquet to you. The car soon arrived at Charles's office at 71st Avenue in Forest Hills, Queens. Seeing that they had arrived home, Charles Doyle and his group got out of the car and entered their office. The adjudicator watched as Charles Doyle and his team left, her heart unable to calm down for a long time. Even though it had been 3 days since Charles became an elder, seeing him in person still felt incredible. She had experienced Charles Doyle's strength, and just his killing intent alone could suffocate her. However, his sudden ascension to an elder and the inheritance of Martham's territory in USA were still unbelievable. Back when Charles had initially wanted the removal of John Wick's expulsion and bounty, she had thought he would use one of the elder's status to achieve it. But she never expected that he would make himself an elder. The world had changed dramatically, and it had a significant impact on her. In her understanding, the 12 seats of the high table had remained unchanged for years, just like when Santino's father died, his sister took over, and when his sister died, his younger brother succeeded her. Charles Doyle had broken this long-standing tradition, and the impact was substantial on her. 60, I came, I conquered. Back in the agency, everyone gathered in the hall and took their seats. Charles began, Ginny, report everyone's identities in the high table as instructed by the adjudicator. When John Wick heard that everyone's identities would be reported, he hesitated for a moment and asked, Boss, am I also going to become an adjudicator? He had a surprised tone, as he had never imagined himself becoming an adjudicator. Even during his prime as a legendary hitman, he had been Vigo's henchman, and the title of Night Devil was the extent of his reputation. Becoming an adjudicator was something he had never considered. Charles smiled and replied, "Yes, you're going to be an adjudicator just like everyone else. Actually, I promised Beretta to open a recovery room in his territory. You'll be responsible for Morocco, and since Sophia also works under Beretta, you can take care of her as well. This way, you can help Beretta and Sophia resolve their misunderstandings. By the way, I've already treated Beretta's injuries on the same day you left." Upon hearing that Charles had healed Beretta, John Wick smiled awkwardly and said, "Thank you, boss. I won't disappoint you." Erica and the others weren't particularly concerned about becoming adjudicators under the high table, but they were pleased with Charles Doyle's elevation in status. The increase in power and position for the person they pledged loyalty to made them happy. If they thought of the high table as a village without a cage, then the elders were like department heads, and Charles now held a position equivalent to a department head in a ninja village. Charles Doyle's increased status and power were reasons for them to be happy. On the other hand, Ginny, who had been reviewing the assets that Mark Tom had given to Charles, suddenly spoke up, "Boss, you need to start making money quickly, unless you want to sell some of these assets." Charles was momentarily surprised. He had just received a generous gift, so why would he need more money? "Ginny, what's the reason?" Ginny continued to review the documents and explained, "Boss, the assets that Elder Mark Tom gave you also come with taxes. Most of them are properties, deeds, and estates, and while they are valuable, they also come with significant annual property taxes. Unless you're considering a violent tax resistance." Charles smirked lightly. It seemed that even in USA, death and taxes were inevitable. Additionally, the armed personnel left by Mark Tom require salaries and expenses for their training. Maintaining these properties and estates will also need money. Suddenly realizing that he had acquired over 100 more mouths to feed, Charles asked, "Ginny, how much cash do I have currently?" Ginny pulled out her notebook and began reporting, "Currently, you have $30 million in cash, with $10 million of it coming from the mission cross assigned to you. And there are the gold and jewelry items you had me sell previously, which are worth several $1,000,000. The exact value will need to be determined when they are traded. However, you had already made an appointment with the landlord next door to purchase his properties, which will also be an expense." Listening to Ginny's report, Charles Doyle realized that he needed to start earning money. He then said, "After the banquet is over, I will release 2 more slots for recovery rooms in Casablanca and New York, and they will be auctioned off. At that time, the slots will provide a steady stream of income through fees and the pricing of the recovery rooms. I'm entrusting all of these tasks to you, Ginny. As for the armed personnel, they will be under your command temporarily, and you can manage their deployment as needed." Hearing that Charles was giving her additional responsibilities and personnel, Ginny accepted without hesitation and nodded in agreement. As for Erica and the other 3, they would be responsible for the tasks in the office and at the Continental Hotel in New York. Since the hotel's missions had been integrated into the mission gathering hall, Charles felt comfortable letting them take on mission-related responsibilities. Charles Doyle pondered for a moment before speaking. "Ginny, did Cross and his son receive the notification about us?" Ginny, hearing Charles mention Cross and his son, replied, "Boss, they are already waiting outside. I'll let them in." Ginny then dialed a number on her phone, and shortly after, Cross entered with his son, Wesley, into Charles Doyle's office. Cross brought his son to stand before Charles and knelt down on one knee, saying, "Respected Mr. Charles Doyle, I am willing to pledge my loyalty to you, and I bring my son, Wesley, to do the same." Evidently, Cross had learned of Charles Doyle becoming an elder of the high table through Ginny. He understood that he was no longer just helping others but offering his loyalty to Charles. Seeing the father and son kneeling before him, Charles Doyle's voice carried an air of authority as he accepted their loyalty, saying, "I accept the loyalty of both of you." Cross and Wesley, having received Charles's acceptance, slowly rose to their feet. Cross then said, "Boss, whatever you need us to do, just give us the orders." Charles Doyle turned his attention to Wesley and asked, "Wesley, have you successfully completed your apprenticeship?" Cross spoke up, "He has completed the initial stage, but he still needs more tasks to further develop." Charles nodded and said, "I will report your identities to the high table, and you will become adjudicators under my command." You and Wesley will be responsible for 2 regions where I plan to collaborate with the local continental hotels to establish recovery rooms. Upon hearing about the recovery rooms, both Cross and Wesley were momentarily surprised but quickly responded, "We will follow your orders." With everything settled, Charles looked at everyone and said, "Rest up, everyone. Be well rested for the banquet tomorrow, where you will meet the leaders of various factions. It will be important for future missions." Soon, everyone dispersed. The next day. Sign in. Ding. System sign-in successful. Reward, 50 servings of delicious ramen. Charles Doyle shook his head as he looked at today's sign-in reward. Delicious ramen was a good item, as it could restore stamina when eaten. However, what he needed more at the moment was system coins. He closed the system interface, and soon, it was 1 p.m. Outside the Charles Doyle agency, the adjudicator arrived right on time, with 3 Rolls-Royce cars parked behind him. "Lord Charles, please get in the car. The banquet is about to begin." Charles nodded and, accompanied by his secretary, Ginny, got into one of the Rolls-Royce cars. This time, Charles Doyle's party had grown from 6 to 8 members. Once everyone was in the car, it started, heading towards the New York Continental Hotel. Today would be the day when Charles Doyle, a name renowned in the global underworld, would shine. 61. The banquet. Outside the Continental Hotel. Winston had been waiting for a while now. It had been 3 days since the adjudicator spared him after answering the elder's call the last time. When he received the name of the new elder announced by the high table, Winston's expression was one of shock. He couldn't fathom how a killer, even a legendary one, the most elite in the United States, could become a figure beyond those rules. However, no matter how incomprehensible it was, the fact was right in front of him, and he could only accept it. At the same time, he couldn't help but sigh. As one grows older, they struggle to keep up with the pace of the times. As Winston was contemplating, 3 Rolls-Royce cars arrived and stopped at the entrance of the Continental Hotel. The welcoming staff rushed forward, opened the car doors, and respectfully invited the occupants out. Charles Doyle stepped out, with the adjudicator on his left, and his secretary, Ginny, on his right. Behind them were Umino Irika, Rock Lee, Uchiha Suzuki. Following them were John Wick, Cross, and Wesley. Winston saw Charles Doyle approaching and hurriedly stepped forward, bowing respectfully. "I'm greatly honored by your presence, Elder Charles Doyle." Charles Doyle walked up and greeted Winston with a light hug, saying with a smile, "Winston, we're old friends. No need to be so formal." Seeing Charles's usual attitude, Winston relaxed a bit but still maintained a respectful demeanor. He replied, "You are now an elder of the high table, so these formalities are necessary. Rules must not be disregarded." Hearing Winston mention the rules, Charles smiled but didn't comment. At this moment, the doorman, with keen insight, opened the hotel's grand entrance. Winston bowed slightly and extended his hand, saying, "Please, Elder Charles Doyle." Charles didn't stand on ceremony, and with his 2 beautiful companions, entered the Continental Hotel. Winston remained outside, watching Charles Doyle's party enter the hotel. When John Wick came up to him, he whispered, "Thank you." John Wick didn't say much, just nodded in acknowledgement, and entered the hotel with Cross and Wesley. Inside the Continental Hotel, the adjudicator led Charles Doyle to the main podium in the banquet area. The banquet was filled with numerous guests. All the leaders of the factions under the high table in the United States had gathered here, including senators and dignitaries who supported the high table. As for lone wolves and assassins, they didn't have the qualifications to attend. Otherwise, with such a massive crowd, they could have easily overcrowded the entire Continental Hotel, which wouldn't be able to accommodate everyone. When they saw someone appearing on the main podium, and realized it was Charles Doyle and the adjudicator, the entire banquet fell silent. Observing the sudden hush in the crowd, the adjudicator stepped up to the microphone and began to speak. "Today is a special day as the high table welcomes its new elder, Charles Doyle." With the words of the adjudicator, the spotlight shone on Charles Doyle. At this moment, the audience's gaze was all on him, filled with curiosity. For this newly appointed elder of the high table, those below had mixed feelings. In the past month, Charles Doyle had caused quite a stir in New York. He first eliminated the formidable Assassin's Brotherhood, then massacred the Russian syndicate's headquarters, and finally, outside the Continental Hotel, he took down numerous assassins. A person with such immense power now stood at the highest position, and those below were filled with curiosity, admiration, and contemplation. They seemed to see a new path unfolding. Seeing the crowd's gaze fixed on Charles Doyle, the adjudicator didn't waste any time and directly announced, "Next, we invite Elder Charles Doyle to give a speech." Then she gave up the microphone's position, and Charles walked up to the microphone, looking at the people below. He slowly spoke, "Becoming a high table elder is a very happy thing. Now, the entire area in the United States is designated as my sphere of influence, and the previous rules remain unchanged. But I will bring something new to all of you in the days to come." Charles paused for a moment, and at this point, his secretary Ginny controlled the central screen to play a video. In the video, the injured John Wick walked into a wax bath and emerged completely healed after just one night. Charles explained, "The wax bath, a miraculous item that can stimulate white blood cells and accelerate the recovery process. Here, bruises, cuts, and fractures can heal in a matter of hours. And I, Charles Doyle, will bring this miraculous item to construct a specialized recovery room in the Continental hotels. Apart from New York and Morocco, 2 more Continental hotels in different cities will have recovery rooms for now. In the future, any faction or individual under the high table will be able to enjoy this service." Hearing Charles's words, the audience burst into applause. Everyone welcomed this opportunity to quickly recover with open arms. Although the rooms wouldn't be built right in front of their homes, as long as the New York Continental Hotel had them, they would still be able to benefit. After all, nobody could guarantee they would never get injured, and even if they themselves were unharmed, what about their top enforcers? Charles raised his hand to signal for everyone to quiet down, and the applause soon subsided. With a smile on his face, Charles said, "Now, I declare that the banquet is officially underway." Without further ado or long speeches, Charles announced his identity and the upcoming new services at the Continental Hotel. Then, he stepped down from the podium. In the banquet area, Ginny handed Charles a bottle of the Macallan Lalique Series 55-year-old single malt whiskey and asked, "This is a gift from Winston, would you like to try it now?" Charles took the bottle of the Macallan Lalique 55 and asked, "Ginny, is it a complete set, or just a single bottle?" Ginny smiled and replied, "Boss, it's a complete set. This bottle is an extra. Would you like to try it now?" Upon hearing that it was a set plus an additional bottle, Charles chuckled and said, "Please thank Winston for me, he's very thoughtful." This set of the Macallan Lalique Series 55-year-old single malt whiskey was not cheap, costing $800,000 for the whole set. More importantly, it was a limited edition, with only 420 sets available worldwide. Ginny took the whiskey and went to open it for Charles. At this moment, a burly man, who appeared to weigh over 200 pounds and was dressed in a suit, approached. Seeing this large man in a suit, Charles smiled and said, "Ah, Kingpin. You're not one of the high table's subordinates. How did you come to today's banquet?" Kingpin walked up to Charles, extended a hand, and said, "Congratulations, Charles, on becoming one of the leaders of the high table." 62. Loyalty, Bonus Chapter. Charles politely shook hands with the Hell's Kitchen's controller and waited for him to continue. Kingpin, with a serious expression, said, "Charles, are you familiar with an organization of ninjas called the Hand?" Hearing the name the Hand, Charles chuckled, "They dare to call themselves ninjas." In his memories, the Hand was an organization composed of defectors from K'un-Lun, and its 5 founders were Alexandra, Madame Gao, Bakuto, Saonde, and Murakami, all of whom were elders from K'un-Lun who had been exiled for attempting to use dragon bone fossils to extend their lifespans. Charles realized some key factors here: New York, Madame Gao, dragon bones, Daredevil, and Iron Fist. He wasn't sure at what stage things were, but he believed they hadn't started excavating the dragon bones yet. Dragon bones. I wonder if they can recharge my system? Please don't disappoint me. Kingpin smiled and didn't find it surprising that Charles Doyle didn't regard the Hand highly. After all, Charles had the power to do so, especially now as an elder of the High Table. The High Table's influence was stronger than that of the Hand, although the Hand had a more mysterious nature. "Charles, recently my operations have been affected by a masked vigilante, and there have been issues with my shipments. Madame Gao is unhappy with me as well due to these problems. I might need your assistance." Kingpin then produced a shuriken with a unique mark and placed it in front of Charles Doyle. Charles raised an eyebrow and didn't expect the item he had just gifted to him to return so soon. He took the shuriken from Kingpin's hand and asked, "Are you still involved in business with Madame Gao?" What do you need me to do? Understanding Charles Doyle's implication, Kingpin knew that Charles had a strong aversion to such types of business. However, he explained, Charles, as you know, Hell's Kitchen is different from the Continental Hotel. I can't refuse it for now. I haven't decided on my course of action yet, but I might need your help when the time comes. Despite Bullseye's excellent marksmanship, his abilities may fall short in this matter. Just as Charles was about to respond, a breaking news story suddenly interrupted the banquet on an electronic screen in the room. The news featured a reporter standing outside Stark Industries tower, reporting, according to our sources, genius playboy Tony Stark has been missing for over 2 months since receiving the annual Peak Award from the military. According to insiders, our genius scientist may have already died. Now, let's attempt to interview Virginia Pepper Potts, Mr. Stark's personal assistant, to verify the authenticity of these claims. But before the reporter could even enter Stark Industries tower, security personnel outside stopped him. Kingpin looked in Charles's direction, and they both saw the news report. He then lamented, it's true that this big capitalist has been missing for quite some time. The gossip news hasn't featured him in a long while. Maxim magazine's cover girl hasn't received his favor in 2 months. I hope he's okay because their company's weapon development is really impressive. Hearing Kingpin's words, Charles knew that Iron Man was about to make an appearance. Iron Man's appearance signaled the beginning of a major event in the Marvel Universe, and the world was no longer going to be peaceful. The matter of the dragon bones had to be put on the agenda. Charles smiled and reassured, a genius like him will be fine. Charles then returned to the previous subject and said, Kingpin, I understand your intentions, and for this matter, I can help you, but just relying on my marker isn't enough. Kingpin pondered for a moment and then asked, what's the price? Looking at the new high table elder in front of him, Kingpin was concerned that Charles might not be satisfied with the current situation and would want to bring Hell's Kitchen into his territory. Charles sensed a slight increase in Kingpin's heart rate and smiled, buddy, don't worry. I don't need your allegiance, and I don't need your organization either. Just when you have a target in mind, you'll need to place an order at my agency. As for the price, it'll be determined based on the mission objectives. Hearing Charles's words, Kingpin felt much more relieved. He had just had a falling out with Madame Gao, and if he offended Charles Doyle as well, he might really have no way to survive. Fortunately, Charles's request was simply for money, which was no problem at all for him. Thank you, Charles Doyle. I will continue to place orders in your agency as before. Charles nodded and didn't say more. At this moment, Ginny came over with a tray that held glasses of Macallan Lalique Series 55-year-old single malt whiskey. Boss, the whiskey is ready. Charles picked up the whiskey and poured some into 3 glasses, handing 2 of them to Kingpin and Ginny. He said, try it. This is a fine bottle from Winston's collection. Kingpin accepted the glass and said, thank you. Ginny set the whiskey and the tray aside and took a glass herself, saying with a smile, thanks, boss. Kingpin took a sip and commented, this whiskey is really good. I have a bottle of Macallan 50-year-old single malt whiskey in my office that I've been reluctant to open. Next time, I'll have Bullseye send it to you. Charles accepted the offer of the whiskey graciously, and just as they were about to continue chatting, Ginny interrupted. Boss, the adjudicator has invited you to the hotel's conference room. The loyalty ceremony is about to begin. Charles put down his glass and told Kingpin, I'm sorry, I have something to attend to. I'll take my leave. Kingpin smiled and replied, don't worry about me. Attend to your own business. I'll be leaving shortly as well. Charles nodded and didn't say anything more. He straightened his suit, then followed Ginny to the hotel's conference room. Inside the conference room, a large chair was placed in the center, and behind the chair stood Charles's 6 subordinates, standing on either side. Charles took a seat in the chair, and Ginny joined Cross's team. Seeing Charles's arrival, the adjudicator spoke, let the loyalty ceremony begin. First to enter was Winston, the manager of the Continental Hotel. He approached Charles and knelt down on one knee, saying, I have served the high table faithfully. From now on, I pledge my loyalty to Elder Charles Doyle and the high table. Winston then removed a necklace he had been wearing around his neck and placed it in Charles Doyle's hands. Charles knew that this was part of the loyalty ceremony, where one would offer their most valuable possession as a symbol of loyalty. In the original timeline, John Wick had even cut off his own finger to prove his loyalty. Charles approached Winston, took the necklace from his hand, and said, Thank you. I accept your offering and loyalty. After that, Charles returned to his seat, and Winston left the room. Then, one by one, the leaders of various factions entered the conference room and stood before Charles to swear their loyalty. 63. 10 consecutive treasure chests. It had been a week since Charles Doyle accepted the allegiance of various factions at the Continental Hotel. During this week, Charles gained the following through the system's daily check-in rewards: 30,000 copper coins, 1 ninja recruitment scroll, 300 reputation points, twice, 50 servings of delicious ramen, 1 ninjutsu scroll, and 200 reincarnation stones. In the meantime, Charles successfully linked the New York Continental Hotel's task reward center to his mission guild. In just 7 days, the Irika squad completed 10 missions. Since there were no high difficulty missions, all 10 missions were rated as C-rank missions. This amount of work was more than what Charles had received in previous months. C-rank missions yielded 500 reputation points, 50,000 copper coins, and 1 regular treasure chest. Charles, therefore, gained 5,000 reputation points, 500,000 copper coins, and 10 regular treasure chests. Looking at his gains in just 1 week, Charles couldn't help but exclaim, becoming a high-ranking elder, the greatest gain isn't the underlings, status, or control over all of America, it's the continuous stream of missions my ninjas can now undertake. He opened the system to check his information. Charles Doyle. Age, 21. Occupation, Ninja. VIP level, 1. Attributes, Fire, Lightning. Secret techniques, Ninja Body Technique, Mastery level 2, grants 90% damage reduction for 4 seconds, but cannot reduce lethal damage. Ninja Body Technique, Wrath level 1, increases attack power by 6% for 10 seconds. Ninjas, Suzuki Uchiha, 2 Tomo Sharingan, Irika Umino, Rock Lee. Skills, Fire Release, Great Fireball, Lion's Barrage, Chidori, 2 Tomo Sharingan, Shuriken Throwing, Barrier Jutsu, Roar of Love, Infinite Dance, Konoha Whirlwind. Reputation, 13,896. Copper coins, 3,517,000. Gold coins, 1,108. Ninja recruitment scrolls, 3. Secret scrolls, 3. Ninja pearls, 1,500. Reincarnation stones, 22,000. Summoning beasts, Ninja Dog Army, max level, AODA, level 0. Artifacts, inactive. Equipment, Chunin Kunao, Chunin Forward Protector, Chunin Vest, Chunin Handbook, Chunin Necklace, Chunin Ring. Charles nodded in satisfaction when he reviewed his earnings over the past month. He was now only 1 ninja recruitment scroll or 68 gold coins away from having enough to activate his second 10 consecutive ninja recruitment. He anticipated that it wouldn't take long to reach that goal. He had already conducted 40 ninja recruitments, and with 20 more, he could unlock the option for a guaranteed S-rank ninja fragment in the 10 consecutive recruitments. Although the current option could also yield good ninja, the probability was incredibly low, with mostly C-rank ninja, some B-rank if you were lucky, and occasionally an A-rank if you were really lucky. As for getting an S-rank ninja directly in the 10 consecutive recruitment, Charles's personal experience from his previous life told him that the odds were astronomically low. Impossible, absolutely impossible. For a guaranteed S-rank ninja fragment, as long as he could find a large number of things that could help in recharging, or make a one-time charge of a huge amount of gold coins, he could stack a powerful S-rank ninja even with fragments. At that time, his own strength would experience a rapid increase, and he wouldn't fall behind in the face of major world-changing events. As for how to activate the artifact, Charles Doyle currently had no clues. Since the system was activated, he hadn't seen an adventure icon on the system page, let alone elite dungeons, there weren't even regular adventure dungeons. So, Charles Doyle had been unable to figure out how to activate the artifact, leaving the reincarnation stones and ninja pearls that were related to it piling up. Regarding the 10 regular treasure chests obtained from the Mission Guild, Charles decided to open them all today. Regular treasure chests could randomly yield copper coins, reputation, gold coins, C/B rank ninja fragments, or recruitment scrolls. 10 regular treasure chests, open. The treasure chests emitted a dazzling light, and after a burst of radiance, the results of the chest openings appeared before Charles Doyle's eyes. Ding! Received 10 gold coins. Ding! Received 200 reputation. Ding. Received 5,000 copper coins. Ding. Received C-rank ninja, Irika Umino fragment X1. Ding. Received C-rank ninja, Hinata Hyuga fragment X1. Ding. Received C-rank ninja, Tenten fragment X1. Ding. Received 10 gold coins. Ding. Received C-rank ninja, Uchiha Sasuke Sharingan fragment X1. Ding. Received 10 gold coins. Ding. Received 10 gold coins. As he looked at the information displayed on the screen in sequence, Charles gave it a cursory glance. The first thing he checked was whether there were any ninja scrolls, but to his disappointment, not a single one of the 10 treasure chests contained a ninja recruitment scroll. Charles Doyle felt quite let down. Charles began to examine his loot from this round. 4 C-rank ninja fragments were not bad, and when added to his previous haul, C-rank ninja Tenten had 3 fragments, and C-rank ninja Hinata Hyuga had 2. He was making progress towards recruiting them, but C-rank ninja Irika Umino and the already fused Sharingan Sasuke Uchiha were still a long way off. As for the 40 gold coins he had obtained, Charles couldn't help but feel a bit helpless. He was now just 28 gold coins short of purchasing 7 ninja recruitment scrolls. Sigh. Charles sighed, stay calm, stay calm. Patience is a virtue. The next 10 consecutive ninja recruitment is bound to bring a breakthrough. This time was just a warm-up. Regarding the gains in reputation and copper coins, Charles didn't pay much attention, as the quantities were relatively low. After completing all these operations, Charles left his office and entered the lobby of the mission center. He had been staying in the office for the past week, not returning to his apartment in the Chrysler building. During this week, Kingpin hadn't come to issue any missions. He probably wanted to try and solve the problem himself, but the former king of the Bowery district, the Bowery King, had approached John Wick and begged to pledge his loyalty to Charles in the hopes of regaining his throne. John Wick had asked Charles for advice on this matter, considering that the Bowery King had helped him and even provided him with a handgun. After all, if it hadn't been for Bowery King helping him, he wouldn't have incurred the High Table's punishment. In the end, Charles accepted the Bowery King's allegiance and assigned him a mission, to investigate the activities of the Hand in the Hell's Kitchen and gather all the information about the Hell's Kitchen buildings, including those that were still under construction. He needed to find out where the dragon bones buried beneath the Hell's Kitchen in New York were hidden. 64. High taxes. As Charles entered the lobby of the agency, he saw Ginny at the front desk, sorting through documents. He greeted her, "Hey, Ginny." Hearing Charles's voice, Ginny looked up from her work, greeted him, and said, "Good morning, boss." Charles approached her and asked, "How are things going?" Ginny finished arranging the documents and handed them to Charles, saying, "Boss, these are the latest financial data. Please take a look." Instead of taking the documents, Charles said, "Ginny, just give me a brief summary." Ginny retrieved the documents and began explaining, "The gold and jewelry from before have all been converted into cash. Due to the source and invoices, they were processed at a discount. We've received a total of $3.50 million. The 2 slots in the wax bath recovery room were auctioned off for a total price of $30 million, and the money has been deposited into our account. Winston and Beretta each contributed $15 million based on the average auction price. After negotiations, we set the price for the recovery room at 2 gold coins and $100,000 for 1 session. Originally, the Continental Hotel wanted to use a gold coin-only service model, but considering your need for cash, we are currently offering services based on both gold coins and money. If there are any changes later, we can adjust it. As for the revenue split, the Continental Hotel takes 10%, and we take 90% plus $100,000. Accounting-wise, settlements will be made on a monthly basis." Charles nodded in approval upon hearing the details about the wax bath recovery room's auction price and service charges. He said, "The prices sound good. Let's go with what you've negotiated. Has John Wick and Cross's son been dispatched?" In response to Charles's inquiry, Ginny replied, "John Wick has already gone to the Continental Hotel in Morocco to oversee the recovery room there. Cross is responsible for the Continental Hotel in Moscow. Wesley is in charge of the Continental Hotel in London. I've equipped each of them with a squad of 10 high-table envoys." Charles was quite satisfied with Ginny's arrangements and said, "Very well, I trust your judgment." Ginny was happy to receive Charles's praise and smiled. She continued, "Additionally, there's the income to discuss. In the past week, Irika and the others completed 10 reward missions, all of which had a $1 million bounty. There's a total bounty of $10 million, with the Continental Hotel taking 10%, and you taking 20%. The office has received $2 million. The remaining money is divided among the three of them. The total income is $65 million. Now, let me inform you about your expenses. The house next door has been purchased for the construction of the recovery room. The overall cost of acquisition and renovation was $500,000. Furthermore, due to the significant assets that Elder Markham gifted you, along with the corresponding gift and inheritance taxes, you'll need to pay a 35% gift tax. Since Elder Markham didn't bear the gift tax for you, you'll have to cover this expense yourself. Upon hearing the figure of 35%, Charles's heart skipped a beat. The tax bureau in this glorious nation was basically a bunch of highway robbers. After a moment of calm, Charles asked, "How much do I need to pay exactly?" After a brief pause, Ginny slowly replied, $1 billion. What? Charles couldn't believe it. This amount of money was astronomical. $1 billion from 2008. What did that even mean? It implied that Markham's gift to him was worth $3 billion. Seeing Charles's surprise, Ginny continued, "And this is considering you've used your $10 million lifetime exemption limit. Otherwise, you'd need to pay an additional $3.5 million in taxes. Fortunately, you don't have to pay it all at once. We can handle the transfer procedure incrementally. You can pay it in installments as we go along, or we can complete the transfer and pay the entire tax amount within the specified time frame." Charles quickly calculated his cash reserves, which added up to around $95 million. Even if he converted all his copper coins in the system to dollars, he'd still be short by $2 million. Fortunately, he didn't have to pay it all at once, otherwise, it would have wiped out his cash flow. Charles looked at Ginny, who was still holding the documents, and asked, "Is there anything else?" Ginny turned a page and continued, "Aside from myself, John Wick, and Cross's son, your monthly expenses for the armed forces salaries and house maintenance costs are approximately $1 million. Property taxes amount to around $3 million annually. In other words, boss, even without considering your income, you'll need at least $15 million annually. If we include our salaries, this amount should exceed $20 million. But don't worry, boss. In addition to the revenue from the recovery room, the New York Continental Hotel pays 10% of its earnings to the elder overseeing the region every year. The various major factions under your jurisdiction also contribute 10% of their earnings to you as their ruler. This is the price of their loyalty. Furthermore, it's not just you as an elder, they also pay 10% of their earnings to the High Table headquarters for its development and maintenance. However, this money will only be received next year, so there's no need to worry about the payment at the moment." Hearing that the High Table and the elders would take 20%, Charles wasn't surprised. He understood that such deductions were standard. Charles glanced at Ginny and said, "Your salaries, aside from the bounties for regular missions, will be based on the adjudicator's standards." Ginny smiled sweetly and replied, "Thank you, boss. Water from afar won't quench your immediate thirst." Charles needed to find a way to make money soon. However, with the reward missions from the Continental Hotel and the newly established Recovery Room project, he wasn't concerned about financial issues. Just as Charles was about to say something, the office's front door was pushed open. On the other side, in Tony Stark's mansion, Pepper Potts was packing up a room. It had been over 2 months since Tony disappeared, and she was beginning to lose hope. While Rhodey had told her that there was no sign of Tony's body at the attack site, there were traces of his blood. The military had been searching, but the absence of a body left room for hope that Tony might still be alive. Happy, Tony's bodyguard, was also in the mansion, assisting with the cleaning. However, it was clear that the burly Happy wasn't cut out for such tasks. Seeing Pepper, distraught and devastated, he thought for a moment before speaking up. "Pepper, there's something I'm not sure whether I should tell you. You know I'm Tony's bodyguard. Now, if anyone can find Tony Stark, I think you might want to try contacting the owner of the Charles Agency. You know, the one in the Continental Hotel. 65, who lost out." Hearing Happy's words, Pepper Potts visibly paused, then turned to look at him, incredulously asking, "Happy, are you serious? Is it true that someone can find Tony when even the military can't?" Happy cleared his throat and spoke solemnly, "You know, I'm Tony's bodyguard, and my line of work exposes me to the underground world's workings. The underground world in the USA has a new ruler now, someone who leads a global organization and is currently in charge of the entire USA region. Even before becoming the ruler, he had an agency called Charles Agency, where numerous people have placed tasks. They've found missing items, people, even pets, no matter where they were taken, even if they were smuggled out of the country, even if they were already dead, they could retrieve them quickly. If you're interested in this agency, maybe they can provide answers, but the prices are somewhat high. I can't afford it. Clearly, Happy's last sentence explained why he hadn't gone to the Charles Agency to place a task and had waited until now. Hearing Happy's words, Pepper directly addressed the heir, Jarvis, bring up all the information on the Charles Agency. Of course, Miss Potts. Please wait a moment. The information has been sent to the tablet on the table. You can browse through it. Pepper Potts walked up to the table, picked up the tablet, and began to examine the information. The tablet displayed all the information available on the Charles Agency from the internet. She read through it, gaining insight into the agency's activities and reputation. After reading all the information, Pepper Potts wore a determined expression. While she would typically avoid dealing with underground forces like this, she couldn't ignore the possibility of finding Tony Stark. She said, Happy, drive me to the Charles Agency. Entering the Charles Agency's premises, Happy escorted Pepper Potts into the lobby. In the lobby, there was a young man and woman standing. Happy whispered, Pepper, the gentleman over there is the owner of this place. Ginny, upon seeing visitors, left her front desk and approached them, asking, How may I assist you, ma'am? Upon seeing the golden-haired beauty in front of her, Pepper Potts turned her gaze towards Charles inside and said, I need to place a task, and I'm looking for his help. Charles had already figured out what this might be about upon seeing them enter, but he hadn't expected them to actually come for his help. Ginny, take them to a meeting room and bring me a blank task scroll. Hearing Charles's instructions, Ginny looked somewhat puzzled as she glanced at the two in front of her. She didn't know what was going on, but her boss wanted a blank task scroll right away. After entering the meeting room, Pepper Potts said, Mr. Charles, I have a task to request, and I hope you can take it on. Charles looked at the weary Pepper and calmly said, I've seen the news from last week, and I can guess what your task is, but I need you to provide me with the details. Pepper adjusted her emotions and continued, 2 months ago, Tony Stark traveled to Afghanistan to deliver weapons to the local U.S. military. After the transaction was completed, on his way back to the U.S. military base, he was attacked by an unidentified armed force. There was no sign of Tony's body at the scene, and we suspect he was kidnapped. His whereabouts are currently unknown. I hope to place a task with you to bring Tony Stark back, even if... At this point, Pepper Potts' eyes welled up, and she couldn't continue speaking. Upon hearing this, Charles knew it was time for him to speak up. Money that fell into his lap was not to be ignored, especially now when he needed funds urgently to pay his taxes. Ms. Pepper Potts, I understand your feelings, but I need to make a few things clear. Since Tony Stark was attacked by an unidentified armed force, rescuing him might involve combat, and the price will be quite high. Furthermore, if I manage to find Tony Stark and bring him back safely from the clutches of this armed force, what price are you willing to pay? Pepper Potts looked at Charles earnestly and said, if you can find Tony Stark and bring him back alive, money is not an issue. I'll pay whatever it takes. Charles then extended one finger and said, this amount. Pepper Potts, considering the situation and Tony Stark's status, replied, if you can bring Tony Stark back alive, I'll pay you $100 million. If Tony is no longer alive, but you can recover his remains, I'm willing to offer $10 million. It was clear that Pepper Potts had made up her mind she wanted to see Tony alive, but she was prepared to accept any outcome. Charles, on the other hand, wasn't aware of Pepper Potts' bottom line. He simply wanted to earn his tax money through this task. However, he realized that he might have undervalued his offer, especially considering he wasn't one to set prices as low as $50,000 like some of his peers. With a smile, Charles said, deal. Both parties believed they were getting a good deal, so who was at a loss here? No one. Charles then opened a blank task scroll, filled in the task details, including the requirements and price, and placed it in front of Pepper Potts for her confirmation. Pepper Potts took the task scroll and carefully reviewed it. Throughout this process, Happy, who had only spoken one sentence since entering, remained as silent as an invisible man. After ensuring the details were correct, Pepper Potts signed her name on the scroll. Seeing that the contract was signed, Charles spoke, "Since this is a missing person task, it's customary to pay half of the task fee up front. However, since I can't provide you with confirmation of Tony Stark's status yet, you can start with $5 million. In addition, I need you to provide an item that Tony Stark carried with him before, preferably something that hasn't been cleaned, like an item with his scent or even hair. This will help me in the search for Tony Stark." As for clothing, it had been 2 months since the incident, and it was likely that Tony's personal effects had been thoroughly cleaned and sanitized. It was doubtful that there would be any trace of scent or hair left. Upon hearing Charles's requirements, Pepper Potts nodded in agreement. She mentioned that she would pay the money later, and as for Tony's personal item, she would arrange for it to be sent over later as well. With all the formalities completed, Charles watched as the two individuals left the agency. 66. Rescuing Tony Stark, Bonus Chapter. Ginny, seeing the two of them leave, asked curiously, "What's the mission? Are you going to take Irika and the others?" Charles smiled and said, "No need, let them continue with their bounty missions. This time, I'll personally take the lead." Hearing that Charles himself was going to be directly involved, Ginny was intrigued. Considering Charles's status as a high-table elder, he hadn't taken on any missions in the past week, it was them who were all busy running errands for him. "How much is the reward?" Ginny didn't ask about the mission details but directly inquired about the bounty. In her view, the only reason Charles would personally get involved must be an extraordinarily high mission reward. Charles's face wore a smile as he extended one finger and slowly uttered 3 words, 100 million. T/N, I am not exactly sure about this number. Sometimes, it is being translated as 1 billion and sometimes 100 million. Hearing such a staggering mission reward, Ginny was momentarily stunned. To put it in perspective, when John Wick offered a maximum bounty of $15 million, it had already incited greed among countless individuals. This 100 million price tag was on a completely different level. Ginny whispered, "Is this about assassinating the president?" Seeing Ginny's reaction, Charles's expression became serious, and the atmosphere between them grew heavy. But just when Ginny thought Charles would nod in agreement, she heard him say, "No." For some unknown reason, Ginny felt relieved. Although Charles was extraordinarily powerful, if he were to assassinate the president of a major nation, it would likely lead to a worldwide manhunt, and he would have to go into hiding. Seeing Ginny's reaction, Charles couldn't hide his amusement. He then said, "Assistant Ginny, prepare to invest all the cash I have under my name in the stock market, except for the funds needed for daily expenses. I'll short Stark Industries." This time, Charles didn't just need to solve his tax issues, he also needed to address his copper coin problem. Without questioning the logic behind Charles's request, Ginny confirmed the order and began to act. Investing $90 million in the stock market, especially shorting a giant like Stark Industries, was a substantial move, even without leverage. However, compared to a $100 million mission reward, it wasn't a major concern. In the afternoon, Happy returned to Charles's office with a box. "Mr. Charles, here are the items you requested." Opening the box, Charles found a wristwatch and a small clump of hair. Seeing these 2 items, Charles nodded in satisfaction and said, "This will do. With these 2 items, there's no problem finding Tony Stark." Clearly, Pepper Potts took Charles's request seriously. She not only sent Tony's personal belongings but also the stray hairs that Tony had left on his bed. Happy, seeing that Charles was satisfied, visibly relaxed, and said, "Mr. Charles, Tony's situation is in your hands. Don't worry, you'll hear good news from me soon." After handing over the items to Charles, Happy left the office. Charles had Ginny book the earliest flight to Afghanistan and placed the box in his storage space. The next day, Charles had just exited the airport in Afghanistan when he felt the scorching sun and the smell of gunpowder in the air. This recently war-torn region was also active with the forces under the High Table's command. He got into the waiting car arranged by Ginny and headed to the location where Tony had been attacked. At this moment, in a hidden mountain cave in the Afghan desert, Tony Stark looked at the miniaturized arc reactor in front of him. Yinsen, who was standing nearby, spoke up, "This doesn't look like a Jericho missile." Tony, still looking at the reactor without lifting his head, replied, "That's because it's a miniature arc reactor. I have a larger one at home that powers my factory. It should be enough to absorb the shrapnel." Yinsen was curious, how much power does it generate? If I'm not mistaken, which I usually am not, it should be around 3 billion joules per second. Hearing this figure, Yinsen looked at Tony and asked, enough to power your heart for thousands of years? Tony confirmed, yes, the big electromagnet powers it for 15 minutes. Then Tony Stark pulled out a set of blueprints and said, this is our escape plan. Yinsen picked up the blueprints but couldn't make sense of them and asked, what is this? Tony Stark rearranged the blueprints slightly and said, try looking at it like this. The blueprint revealed the design of a suit of powered armor. Yinsen exclaimed, wow! It's incredible! At that moment, Yinsen was once again in awe of Tony Stark's genius. Only someone like him could still be this determined to survive in such dire circumstances. In the deserts of Afghanistan, a military armored vehicle was speeding along. Inside the vehicle, Charles Doyle seemed to be resting with his eyes closed, but in reality, his consciousness had entered the system space. System, perform the daily check-in. Ding! Check-in successful. Rewards, Ninjutsu Secret Scroll. Exiting the check-in page, Charles immediately opened the Summoned Beast interface. For this rescue mission involving Tony Stark, Charles intended to send his Summoned Beast, AODA. After all, according to his memory, the Ten Rings organization, which had held Stark captive, had a significant amount of heavy firepower in the vicinity. There were even machine guns and artillery shells. If it weren't for Tony Stark being the main character, it would have been a major problem for him to escape. However, with AODA's massive body and impenetrable scales, it should be effective in clearing out enemy positions. As Charles looked at the interface, he noticed AODA's current level was 0, and he required 200 reputation points and 20,000 copper coins to level up. Each subsequent level would require more resources. However, with each level up, AODA's power would significantly increase, both in terms of attack damage and defense. Charles checked his current resources, 3.522 million copper coins and 14,096 reputation points. Charles thought to himself, hopefully, my reputation points will allow AODA to level up further. In the next moment, Charles began AODA's leveling journey. After spending all of his reputation points and 3.02 million copper coins, Charles upgraded AODA to level 20, significantly boosting its strength. However, there was still a long way to go to reach the maximum level of 50. Afterward, the car quickly arrived at the location where Tony Stark had been attacked. 2 months had passed since the incident, and the area was no longer under lockdown, allowing anyone to visit. After getting out of the car, Charles instructed, you can head back. If I need you to pick someone up, I'll notify you through the satellite phone. 67. B-Rank Mission. After the group left in their armored vehicles, Charles entered the system space once again. He opened the mission gathering place and found that the missions on the board had all been completed. He immediately chose to claim the rewards. Ding! Mission complete. Reward, 500 reputation points, 50,000 copper coins, 1 ordinary treasure chest. Ding! Mission complete. Reward, 500 reputation points, 50,000 copper coins, 1 ordinary treasure chest. Ding! Mission complete. Reward, 500 reputation points, 50,000 copper coins, 1 ordinary treasure chest. Upon seeing the first reward notification, Charles promptly submitted the rescue mission for Tony Stark. The mission gathering place began to assess the mission's rank, and it was ultimately classified as a B-rank mission. Seeing this result, Charles was quite satisfied. It was better than a C-rank mission. However, he knew that without extraordinary something happening, the mission's rank wouldn't increase to AORS. Charles observed his surroundings, ensuring there were no cameras on the roadside and no one nearby. Then, he gestured with his hands and used his summoning jutsu. Summoning jutsu. A puff of smoke dissipated, and Parker's figure appeared before Charles. Parker glanced around, confirmed there was no combat situation, and immediately spoke, "Lord Charles, what do you summon me for?" Charles took out a box that Happy had sent him from his storage space. He retrieved a wristwatch from it and asked, "Can you still smell the scents on this?" Parker approached the wristwatch, took a whiff, and then said, "There are 2 people's scents on it. The first one is quite clear, but the second one is very faint. It's been too long, and it's almost dissipated. Tracking it may be troublesome." Clearly, after 2 months, even if it had been frequently worn before, the scent had mostly dissipated. Plus, the watch still retained Pepper Pot's scent, making it more challenging to track. Charles pointed at a tuft of hair inside the box and said, "Parker, confirm the scent on this." Following Charles's orders, Parker sniffed the scent on the hair tuft, sniffed around on the ground, and then turned around. Finally, he spoke, "Lord Charles, I've found the owner of the scent." Parker looked toward the direction of the desert and said, "You and the desert seem to have a connection. The target this time is still in the direction of the desert, but it's farther away than last time." Hearing Parker's words, Charles smiled and said, "Parker, let's go." And so, one human and one dog set off toward the desert in Afghanistan. On the other side, inside the cave, Yinsen had just replaced the arc reactor for Tony Stark, freeing him from the need to hold onto the battery at all times. Tony sat up and looked down at the reactor on his chest, feeling more hopeful about their escape from the cave. Tony put on his clothes and, along with Yinsen, took out a board game. They began playing a couple of rounds. Clearly, even when kidnapped, Tony needed some relaxation. After playing a couple of rounds, Tony Stark asked, "You still haven't told me where you're from." Yinsen picked up the dice and shook them in his hand. "I'm from a town called Megala. It's a beautiful place." While pouring some water, Tony asked, "Do you have a family?" Yinsen looked up at Tony Stark and replied with a hint of relaxation on his face, "Yes, I do. After we escape, I plan to visit them." He then returned the question, "Do you have a family?" Tony Stark fell silent at Yinsen's question, and his mouth twitched slightly. Finally, he said, "No." Hearing Tony Stark's response, Yinsen repeated, "No." He added with a touch of regret, "You have everything, yet you have nothing." Clearly, in Yinsen's eyes, family was the foundation of everything. Tony Stark glanced at Yinsen and smiled slightly. He then put down the dice and said, "Buddy, it's time for us to get to work." Tony went to the pile of components and started his welding work. Meanwhile, outside the detention area, a lower-ranking member of the Ten Rings approached the iron gate, opened a small window, and glanced inside, confirming that the two were working. He nodded and turned to leave with his subordinates. In front of the surveillance footage, a member of the Ten Rings held a photo of the Jericho missile and compared it to Tony's assembly. He commented, "It doesn't look anything like the picture." Another member nearby offered an explanation, "Maybe it's a modified version." Watching the surveillance footage, the person holding the photo spoke again, "The tail section is wrong, it should be placed backward." Outside the cave, several members of the Ten Rings were building a fire and warming their hands. Zayla, the leader of this faction of the Ten Rings responsible for kidnapping Tony Stark, watched the surveillance footage showing Tony working on the leg mechanization. She touched a round ring on her arm and fell into deep thought. Before long, Zayla entered the cave with many of her subordinates. She walked into the room, looked around, and saw Tony Stark with his hands on his head. She approached him, gently pushed aside his chest of clothing, and touched the miniature arc reactor on his chest. "Bows and arrows," Zayla said, "there was a time when they were considered cutting-edge weaponry." Zayla didn't detect anything unusual. She then walked over to the components that Tony Stark had manufactured and continued, "Genghis Khan once used it to sweep across Eurasia, dominating the world. The territory exceeded that of Alexander the Great by 5 times and was 4 times the size of the Roman Empire." As Zayla spoke, she examined the blueprints on the workbench and added, "But today, only those with the most advanced Stark weapons can rule the world." 68, AODA. Tony Stark became nervous when he saw Zayla pick up the blueprints from the table. Yinsen gestured to Tony to remain calm. Zayla glanced at the blueprints but couldn't understand what was depicted on them. She put the blueprints down and turned back and continued to say, "And that person will be me." Approaching Tony Stark, Zayla questioned, "Why did you disappoint me?" Yinsen, standing nearby, quickly explained, "We're working very hard." Hearing Yinsen's words, Zayla turned to look at him and asked seriously, "I spared your lives, and this is how you repay me?" Yinsen looked at her, extended his hands, and said, "It's complicated. He's been working very hard." Zayla ordered her subordinates, "Make him kneel." 2 members immediately came forward and pressed Yinsen down, forcing him to kneel in front of Zayla. Tony Stark clenched his fists, unable to do anything but glance at the components on the table. Zayla turned around, picked up a pair of pliers, and a piece of burning charcoal with them. She said, "Do you think I'm a fool? I'll figure it out." Yinsen looked nervous and hastily explained, "We're both working very hard for you." Using the pliers, Zayla held the red-hot charcoal and cruelly said, "Open your mouth." Tony Stark, confused by the situation, asked, "What are they trying to do?" But nobody paid attention to Tony Stark's question. With one hand pressing Yinsen's head, Zayla said calmly, "Do you think I'm an idiot? What is he doing? What's going on? Tell the truth." As she spoke, she held the pliers with the burning charcoal close to Yinsen's face. Seeing this situation, Yinsen immediately said, "He's making the Jericho missile you want." Zayla interrupted and glared, "Tell me the truth." Yinsen repeated, "He's making the Jericho missile you want." Zayla placed the burning charcoal in front of Yinsen's eyes once more and angrily shouted, "Tell me the truth." Yinsen, feeling the heat from the burning charcoal, shouted for the third time, "He's making the Jericho missile you want." Tony Stark couldn't bear it any longer and took a step forward, saying, "What delivery date do you want? I can do it." Seeing Tony Stark's movement, Zayla's subordinates raised their firearms, aiming them at Tony. One of the lower-ranking leaders in the front even extended his hand to dissuade him, saying, "Don't move." Tony, seeing the tense reactions of the people around him, immediately stopped and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. Facing Zayla, Tony said, "I need him." He then looked at Yinsen and added, "He's useful." Hearing Tony Stark's words, Zayla put down the charcoal she was holding and said sternly, "Tomorrow, at the latest, complete the missile assembly." She then threw the pliers on the ground and instructed her subordinates, "Keep an eye on them." With that, she left the cave with her men, without looking back. Once the Ten Rings members left, Tony Stark officially began his grand show of forging. At this moment, dark clouds covered the moon, and snowflakes began to fall in the Afghan desert. Outside a mountain ridge, Parker stopped in his tracks, turned his head, and said to Charles, "Lord Charles, the Sense owner is just ahead, but there are many people in front of the cave." Charles quietly approached the hill and looked down. In front of them, there was a cave with guards, a burning campfire, rudimentary defenses and some firearms. After confirming that this was the right place, Charles said, "Thank you for your hard work, Parker. In the upcoming battle, I need you to enter the cave and protect the target you just tracked." Charles knew that Tony hadn't finished building his armor yet, but it wasn't far from completion. He didn't want to wait too long and risk Tony escaping on his own. When it comes to saving someone, it's essential to act before the other party solves their problems. If everything is already prepared, his value upon arrival would greatly diminish. Even though he was hired by Pepper, if he successfully brought Tony back safely, who could say that Tony wouldn't owe him a favor? Upon hearing Charles's orders, Parker replied, "Of course, Lord Charles. I will ensure the safety of the target." Charles had complete confidence in Parker's abilities, which was also an insurance policy to prevent the other party from panicking and attacking Tony if they felt threatened. Charles activated his Sharingan and observed that Parker had entered the cave without being detected by anyone. He then formed hand seals and used the summoning jutsu once again. The enormous form of AODA appeared at Charles's feet, and at that moment, a voice came from below, "Lord Charles, you've finally summoned me. How may I assist you? AODA will do its best to fulfill your commands." Clearly, AODA had been waiting for its summon ever since it arrived in Charles's spiritual realm. Today, it finally saw its summoner. Due to AODA's massive size and the loud commotion caused by its summoning, it drew the attention of the guards below. One of the guards said, "Someone's talking, the enemy is here. Sound the alarm." In the next moment, alarms blared loudly. Zayla, who had just returned to her tent and fallen asleep, was immediately awakened. She got up, grabbed her gun, and rushed outside. Seeing that the disturbance below had been noticed, Charles didn't waste any time talking to AODA further. He gave a direct command, "AODA, aside from the person protected by Parker, eliminate all these people outside the cave." AODA's enormous eyes glanced at the people below, and it swiftly dove into the ground. In the next second, it emerged within the enemy's position. In an instant, its serpentine tails rose from the ground and lifted the members of the Ten Rings into the air. Simultaneously, it released a massive cloud of poisonous gas on the ground. Countless members of the Ten Rings were killed or injured instantly. Some others, who had rushed out due to the alarm, saw the serpent's tails in the sky and frantically fired their guns. Bullets struck AODA's scales, producing sparks of metal clashing. Seeing that AODA had already begun its work, Charles didn't linger. He rushed towards the entrance of the cave. Inside the cave, Stark was busy with blacksmithing. Suddenly, he heard some commotion at the entrance. In the next moment, a Belgian Malinois dog chewed a large hole in the iron gate and entered. Surprised by this sight, Tony exclaimed, "Is this dog a mutant? His bite is so strong." Parker immediately appeared in front of Tony Stark with a quick movement. He sniffed the air lightly and confirmed that he was here to protect the right person. He then directly said, "You're the one who's the mutant here. I'm Ninja Dog Parker." 69. Parker's lifelong meal ticket. Looking at the Belgian Malinois dog that was speaking in front of him, even Tony Stark, who had seen a lot in his life, was momentarily stunned. Yinsen, who was beside him, pointed at Parker and exclaimed, "A dog, a dog. The dog is talking." Clearly, the shock of all this was even greater for Yinsen. Parker, in response to the two men's reactions, wasn't surprised. He simply said to Tony Stark, "Sir, I am here on behalf of Lord Charles to protect you." Hearing a talking dog claiming to be sent to protect him, Tony couldn't believe his ears. A Belgian Malinois, even if it could talk, wouldn't have much combat power. It couldn't withstand a hail of bullets, especially since there were not just a few armed men outside but over 100. Just as Tony Stark was about to say something, gunfire and screams from outside the cave reached his ears. It made him realize that someone was indeed coming to rescue him. Seeing his unfinished Iron Man suit, Tony Stark found himself in a dilemma. Should he wait for the rescue or try to assemble his armor right away? But there wasn't enough time to assemble the suit. He hated this feeling of not being in control of the situation. Tony looked at Parker and asked, "Who is Charles? Are you friends with our military, sent by Colonel Rhodes?" Clearly, Tony considered this talking dog to be the result of some secret military experiment. While he hadn't participated in various peculiar experiments, he had heard about some things. Parker looked at the man in front of him and said, "I don't know who Rhodes is, and I'm not with the military. I'm a contract summoning beast of Lord Charles. We are not affiliated with the military." By now, the commotion both inside the detention room and outside had alerted the guards in the cave. 3 members of the 10 Rings, carrying firearms, were rushing toward the interior. Parker sensed their approach and warned, "Try to find a place to hide and stay away. Enemies are coming." Hearing Parker's words, Tony Stark and Yinsen exchanged a glance and immediately began looking for cover and positions with shooting blind spots. Although this detention room didn't have good hiding spots, Tony and Yinsen positioned a large piece of armor vertically in front of them to shield themselves from stray bullets. The 3 guards who had arrived at the detention room's entrance, seeing the hole in the door, cursed, "Damn it." One of them immediately opened a small window but didn't see anyone inside. He shouted, "Yinsen, Stark. Answer quickly, what are you doing in there?" Tony looked at Yinsen, puzzled, and asked, "What is he saying?" Yinsen replied helplessly, "He's speaking some other language, which I don't understand." Seeing that there was no response, the guard shouted, "Come out, let me see you. If you don't come out now, you'll regret it." Seeing that there was still no response, the guard didn't wait any longer. He took out a key and unlocked the heavy iron door, entering with the other 2 guards. As soon as they entered, they saw a Belgian Malinois dog standing in front of them. One of the guards cursed, "Where did this dog come from?" Although Parker didn't understand what the guard was saying, he could tell it wasn't a compliment. He immediately showed an aggressive expression. Despite being a ninja dog, he had a ninja's headband and insignia from the Hidden Leaf Village. Parker swiftly moved and extended his claw toward one of the guards. Pang! The guard who had just spoken was sent flying as if he had been hit by a car, crashing into the nearby wall, his fate uncertain. The other 2 guards had their vision blurred for a moment, witnessing their comrade being launched into the air and crashing into the wall. This sight prompted them to immediately raise their guns and start shooting. However, Parker was incredibly fast, and their marksmanship was only at the level of a novice. Astonishingly, not a single shot hit Parker. Instead, he swiftly dispatched both guards with a single swipe of his paw. While the stray bullets didn't hit Parker, they came dangerously close to hitting the hiding Yinsen in the corner. Tony Stark witnessed the scene and exclaimed, "Parker, nicely done." He hadn't expected that the Belgian Malinois in front of him possessed such astonishing abilities. If only he could have a guard dog like Parker, wouldn't that be? Tony Stark shouted loudly to Parker, "Parker, I've decided. I'll cover all your dog food expenses from now on, and it'll be the most luxurious kind." Parker's eyes lit up. Although dog food in this world didn't provide any energy, it did have a good taste. So, he replied immediately, "Sir, it's a deal." Back on the hillside, Charles Doyle watched AODA's attack with great satisfaction. As AODA spewed its poisonous fog, many members of the Ten Rings collapsed, clutching their faces in pain, making it difficult for them to make an effective counterattack. Charles seized the opportunity, dashing into the battlefield below. AODA's attacks and poison had no effect on him, and he continued to execute the incapacitated terrorists. Since it was nighttime and the toxic fog was prevalent, some of the Ten Rings fighters who had not yet fully awakened and rushed out of their tents found themselves dying under the poisonous fog. Outside the cave, a large amount of green poison fog filled the air. Luckily, there was no wind tonight to blow the toxic fog into the cave. Otherwise, Charles wouldn't have dared to let AODA attack so recklessly. If the toxic fog had infiltrated the cave, he wouldn't be able to take Tony Stark out alive. Instead, he would have returned with a corpse. The Marvel Universe would lose a lot of fun without him. Charles Doyle went on a rampage, eliminating all the remaining resistance of the Ten Rings. However, he didn't find their leader, Zayla. Zayla had run out of her tent without looking back when she saw the sea of serpent tails and the billowing toxic fog. Although she didn't know what kind of creature it was, she understood that it was beyond her capability to handle. She needed to find her boss, Su Wenwu. While their Ten Rings leader was still busy training his son, Su Wenwu, who held the power of the Ten Rings, was someone no one could stop. With this in mind, Zayla swiftly navigated through an underground passage and ran towards her destination. After confirming that there was no sign of Zayla's body, Charles had to give up. He considered that she had simply gotten lucky. As for whether Zayla would cause trouble for Tony Stark in the future, Charles didn't care. His mission was merely to bring the other party back alive. 70, Mark the 1st, Bonus Chapter. Having dealt with the external threats, Charles Doyle approached the AODA and said, "AODA, I'll leave the outside to you. If anyone else shows up, just take care of them." "Understood, Lord Charles." After giving this command to AODA, Charles entered the cave in front of him. Thanks to the illumination from the lights inside, the cave wasn't too dark. Charles deactivated his Sharingan. Navigating through several twists and turns, Charles reached the place where Tony Stark was held captive. The iron door was wide open, and there were 7 or 8 bodies lying around the room. In the center of the room, Parker lay on the ground, gazing at the entrance. When he saw Charles arrive, Parker spoke, "Lord Charles, the mission has been successfully completed without harm to the target." "Thank you, Parker." Charles approached and patted Parker's head. Hearing their conversation, Tony Stark and Yinsen emerged from a corner of the room. Tony looked at the man before him curiously and asked, "Are you Charles? Who sent someone to rescue me?" "My military friend, Colonel Rhodes." Tony Stark asked 2 questions in a row, then glanced at Parker by Charles's side and commented, "Your ninja dog is incredible." Charles looked at the 2 men before him, Tony Stark and Yinsen. He wasn't surprised that Yinsen had survived. After all, he had sent Parker, so saving Tony meant Yinsen wouldn't be in danger. However, Charles wondered if Yinsen's survival would affect the birth of Iron Man. Looking at the unfinished Mark the 1st armor on the ground and the arc reactor on Tony's chest, Charles considered that as long as they had these 2 things, there shouldn't be any problems. Without dwelling on these thoughts, Charles spoke, "I'm Charles Doyle, the owner of Charles's agency. As for why I'm here and came to rescue you, it's because of your secretary, Pepper Potts. She came to my agency to commission a mission, hoping that I could bring you back alive. And she's paying $100 million for it." Hearing that it was Pepper Potts who had asked for Charles's help, Tony Stark was visibly surprised. He hadn't expected her to be the one to ultimately find him. As for the $100 million, he didn't care much. Tony Stark looked at Charles and said, "Thank you. It seems like your agency is quite capable. The US military couldn't find me, but you did." Charles smiled and then glanced at the scattered parts in the room. He then said, "For the people left alive here, it should only be the 2 of you. I've taken care of the rest. So, if you don't have anything to gather, let's leave after some time." Tony, hearing that there were no more enemies around, visibly brightened. He then said, "No need to gather anything, I don't want to stay here for another minute. Let's go." Seeing Tony's impatience, Charles shook his head and replied, there's toxic fog outside the cave, which hasn't dissipated yet. It's not suitable to leave now. If you don't have anything to pack up, just wait here for a while. Upon hearing Charles mention the toxic fog outside, Tony asked in surprise, "Did you use a gas bomb?" "That thing is prohibited. But don't worry, no one will hold you accountable. I'll take care of it." Evidently, Tony thought Charles had used a gas bomb to quickly resolve the situation. Charles chuckled, "It's not a gas bomb, but it is indeed toxic fog. You'll see when we leave later." Hearing Charles say they would find out when they left, Tony didn't press further and decided to start assembling his armor with Yinsen. Although they no longer needed it for combat, abandoning something they had almost finished wasn't Tony Stark's style. As Tony began assembling the Mark I armor, Charles watched with keen interest. While the Mark I had limited capabilities, it was the prototype for Tony's Mark series, making its creation significant for the future of Iron Man. For a Marvel fan like Charles, it was also a nice collectible. As Tony worked on the Mark I, he asked, "Charles, do you own a biological research institute?" Charles was momentarily surprised by the offbeat question but quickly realized what Tony was referring to when he saw Parker lying nearby. He then replied, "Tony, I don't have a biological research institute, and Parker's ability to speak isn't due to any biological research." Hearing Charles's response, Tony shrugged nonchalantly and continued assembling the armor. He then asked, "Charles, can I have a ninja dog like Parker? It should be called a ninja dog, right? I'm willing to pay a certain price, and you can name your price. I particularly like golden retrievers." Charles understood that Tony had also been won over by Parker and wanted a ninja dog of his own. Regrettably, he replied, "Tony, you can't have a ninja dog. It's not something you can obtain with money in this world. They are unique, and no amount of money can get you one." Tony, hearing Charles's refusal, sighed, "Well, it looks like I won't be able to have my own ninja dog. Parker, I promise to provide you with a lifetime supply of premium dog food. Where should I send it when I get back?" Charles was a bit surprised that Parker had just acquired a meal ticket for himself. Parker, seeing that Charles doesn't have any objection, replied, "Sir, please send it to Charles's agency." Once all the parts were assembled, Tony put on the Mark I armor and said, "Yinsen, help me fasten the screws." Yinsen followed Tony's instructions, tightening the screws as needed. When most of the screws were secured, Tony instructed, "Yinsen, help me power it up." Setting down his tools, Yinsen turned to Tony and asked, "Tell me what to do." Function key 11. Let me know when you see the progress bar. Following Tony's instructions, Yinsen operated the computer. He then said, "All right, it's appeared. It should start initializing now." Tony continued with instructions, Control key I, then press Enter. Meanwhile, Charles stood by, silently observing the two men's actions. Soon, the progress bar filled up, and Tony Stark's Mark I armor was fully activated. By this time, the sun had risen, the toxic fog had dissipated, and a giant snake, over 100 meters long, lay outside the cave, watching the activity around the cave entrance. 71. Big Leaping Monkey. As the Mark I armor successfully powered up, the circuits inside the cave immediately failed, plunging the detention chamber into darkness. Tony Stark, clad in the Mark I armor, activated the suit and took a step forward, each footstep carrying a heavy metallic weight. With an air of confidence, Tony addressed his companions, "Ladies and gentlemen, behold the latest invention of the genius inventor, Tony Stark." He then led the way out of the cave, each step heavy and imposing due to the suit's weight. Charles, followed by Parker, joined him, while Yinsen followed suit. Outside the cave, they were met with the sight of a colossal snake, 100 meters in length, with ice-cold and cruel eyes. Its head was the size of a house, sending shivers down their spines. If it weren't for the armored suit, Tony's legs would have given way beneath him at the sight of the monstrous creature. Yinsen, on the other hand, was less fortunate, collapsing to the ground upon seeing the snake. The blue snake, known as AODA, saw Charles emerge and immediately greeted him, "Lord Charles, your assigned task has been completed, and no more enemies have appeared." Clearly, AODA understood that anyone emerging from the cave with Charles was not an enemy. Otherwise, it would have dealt with them as soon as the armored suit appeared. Tony, hearing AODA address Charles as Lord, understood the situation. This enormous snake was not a creation of nature but one of Charles's subordinates. After offering his gratitude to AODA, Charles helped Yinsen to his feet. Tony, still inside the Mark I armor, raised the helmet's faceplate, revealing his face. He observed the massive snake before him and the ruined campsite. Then, he said, "Your blue snake is amazing, but now, it's time to show you all my latest invention. Could you ask your pet to clear some space for us?" Charles didn't refuse, as he was also curious about the capabilities of the Mark I armor. He instructed AODA, "AODA, wait for us on the hill." AODA raised its head, glanced at everyone, and responded, "Of course, Lord Charles." Then, it burrowed underground and disappeared. Tony was relieved to see that the colossal snake was under Charles's full control. However, he couldn't help but think that Charles was another eccentric biologist. Charles watched with interest as Tony began to demonstrate the capabilities of the Mark I armor. He showcased the suit's capabilities, including the powerful punches, missile launchers in the arms, and even the built-in flamethrower. Charles was captivated by the spectacle, enjoying the show even more than a 3D movie or even a 5D experience. The explosive sounds, the waves of heat from the flames, though lacking real enemies, still made for a thrilling display. After demonstrating the suit's weaponry, Tony activated the flight system, and the Mark I armor rocketed into the sky. He exclaimed, "Did you see that? My armor can fly." However, his excitement was short-lived as the propulsion system abruptly shut down, causing the armor to disassemble in mid-air. It plummeted to the desert below. "Ah!" With a cry of despair, Tony crashed into the sand. Fortunately, the armor's shock-absorbing mechanisms, combined with the soft desert sand, left him unharmed. Tony removed his helmet, looked at the scattered parts, and chuckled, "Not bad." Yinsen saw Tony shouting and plummeting downward, so he rushed towards him. Charles glanced around. Observing the boxes marked Stark Industries nearby, Charles smirked. He thought to himself, maybe these bombs will come in handy someday. Charles walked over to the crates of ammunition and with a wave of his hand, stored them all in his system's inventory. After securing the ammunition, Charles and Parker joined Tony Stark. Watching Tony, who was still in the pit with Yinsen helping him climb out, Charles teased, "Tony, your last act as a big leaping monkey was quite impressive." Tony's face turned sour as he cursed, "You bastard, that was flight, not some big leaping monkey show. Don't think I don't know what big leaping monkey means." Seeing Tony's exasperation, Charles couldn't help but laugh and said, "Well, it looked like a big leaping monkey to me." He then approached Tony, reached down, and effortlessly pulled him out of the sand pit. Tony was surprised by Charles's strength and gave him a look. This guy, with a well-proportioned physique, didn't look like someone who possessed the immense strength he had just displayed. Where were the bulging muscles that usually accompanied such feats of strength? Unable to figure it out, Tony decided not to dwell on it and instead turned his attention to the desert ahead. He asked, "So, buddy, how are we getting out of here?" Seeing Tony had removed his armor and was now looking at the scattered pieces, Charles grinned and said, "I'll take care of that. Do you want to pack any of this stuff?" Tony shook his head at the sight of the scattered pieces on the ground and replied, "No need. I can build something better when I get back." Charles nodded and said, "Well, if you don't mind, then it's mine." Tony clapped his hands together and said, "It's all yours." With Tony's consent, Charles nodded and instructed Parker, "Parker, collect all the armor parts." Following Charles's command, Parker used his keen sense of smell to retrieve all the scattered parts, even those buried in the sand. Charles took out a satellite phone, dialed a number, and ordered, "Prepare a private plane for a direct flight to New York. Have the car that brought me here yesterday meet me where I got off yesterday." After ending the call, Parker had already retrieved all the parts and placed them in front of Charles. Charles looked at the parts on the ground and then at the two of them. He didn't see any need to hide anything and simply waved his hand, making all the parts disappear. Chapter 72, Returning to New York. Tony Stark and Yinsen stared at the disappearing parts in amazement. Today, they had encountered too many unbelievable things. Tony Stark walked up to Charles and pondered, "Do you have knowledge of spatial storage technology?" Charles shook his head, avoiding further discussion on this topic with Tony Stark. He didn't possess spatial storage technology. He couldn't craft sealing scrolls or storage scrolls, and there were no such items available in the system store. Currently, he only had access to ninja tools like explosive tags, kunai, and shuriken. As for ninja fragments or directly purchasing ninjas with gold coins, who can make those things, those hadn't appeared yet. He wasn't sure if they required a system update to become available or if they simply wouldn't be accessible. Seeing that Charles didn't want to dwell on the topic, Tony Stark didn't press further. As a genius scientist, he deeply understood that such technologies were not something people casually discussed with others. Charles, what should we do next? Should we leave here and exit the desert? Charles called out, AODA. In the next moment, a massive blue snake, 100 meters in length, emerged from the desert. Its enormous body was revealed as it spoke, Lord Charles, what are your orders? Charles held Tony Stark and Yinsen in his hands and leaped onto the head of the giant blue snake. Appearing suddenly on the snake's head surprised both Tony Stark and Yinsen. They heard Charles instruct, Parker, lead the way at full speed. AODA, carry us and follow Parker. Understood, Lord Charles. X2. Parker sped off in the direction they had come from, moving as fast as lightning, covering a considerable distance in the blink of an eye. AODA, with its colossal body, moved swiftly across the desert as if it were level ground. Charles stood on the snake's head, securing himself in place with chakra. Tony Stark and Yinsen, still held by Charles, were fixed by his side. Given the snake's speed, they could easily be blown away by the strong winds if Charles let go. The strong desert wind blew against Tony Stark's face, but he showed no fear. He found the sensation exhilarating. He had driven race cars, ridden horses, piloted yachts, and flown airplanes, but riding a snake was an entirely new experience for him. Hey, buddy, your snake is incredible. How about we discuss this? Can I have one too? If that's possible, could you consider letting me keep one at my place? I'll definitely build a huge enclosure and feed it high-quality beef. What do you say? As long as I get to ride it occasionally. By the way, what about a ninja dog? Can you consider letting me adopt one? I'm willing to pay, or I could hire it as my bodyguard. I think it's much better than happy. Listening to Tony Stark's non-stop chatter, Charles was momentarily stunned. Was this Iron Man? No wonder he treated Spider-Man like his son, it really seemed fitting. Mr. Stark, they are not commodities. They can't be sold or adopted. They are my battle companions. Please stop considering these options. Hearing Charles's refusal once again, Tony also had his pride. He didn't say anything further. His true thoughts remained a mystery to those around him. Parker, with AODA in tow, quickly arrived at the location where Charles had disembarked earlier. Charles, holding Tony Stark and Yinsen, jumped down from the snake's head. He couldn't help but laugh at the sight of their messy hair. Tony initially didn't understand what was happening, but seeing Yinsen's reaction, he quickly caught on and began trying to fix his own hairstyle as best as he could. However, the hairstyle that was fixed in place by the strong winds wasn't something he could easily adjust with just a few moves. Ultimately, his efforts were in vain. Charles walked over to AODA, gave him a pat on the head, and said, "You've worked hard today, AODA. Let's return to the summoning world for now." Afterward, he crouched down, patted Parker, and continued, "And you too, Parker. Let's go back together. I'll summon you when I need you." Understood, Lord Charles. X2. Then, with a bang, a cloud of smoke enveloped them, and the massive body of the blue snake, as well as the ninja dog Parker, disappeared from the sight of Tony, Yinsen, and Charles. Yinsen, who witnessed this scene, was left dumbfounded. "No, they're gone." Turning away from Yinsen, Tony Stark, who was still busy fixing his appearance, didn't turn around but asked curiously, "Yinsen, what's gone?" "The giant snake and the ninja dog, they've all disappeared." Hearing Yinsen's words, Tony Stark immediately turned around and looked at the empty road, murmuring, "They really disappeared." At this moment, Tony Stark looked at Charles with a complex expression. He knew this was definitely not some simple spatial technology. Unable to contain his astonishment, Tony Stark exclaimed, "Mr. Charles, what kind of technology is this?" Charles briefly explained to Tony Stark about ninjas and summoning jutsu, but Tony wore an expression that said, "You can keep making things up, but don't treat me like a child." This made Charles realize there was no need to continue explaining. So, let him think of me as a biologist. Soon, the high-table emissary arrived in an armored vehicle and transported Charles and the others to the airport in Afghanistan. At the airport, Yinsen parted ways with everyone and chose to return to his hometown, declining Tony Stark's invitation to go back to New York together. Finally, Charles and Tony Stark boarded the private plane prepared by the high table and headed for New York. Tony looked at Charles and remarked, "Your status is quite extraordinary, even though this private plane is of a slightly lower class than mine. If you have the chance, I'll show you my private plane." Charles shrugged and didn't mind. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, saying, "Miss Pepper Potts, I've found Tony Stark and safely brought him back. We're currently on a plane and will arrive at the New York airport in about 6 hours. You can arrange for someone to pick him up and take him home." "Yes, that's right, Tony Stark is safe and sound." Then Charles placed the satellite phone on the table in front of Tony, signaling him to answer the call. Tony picked up the phone from the table and proceeded to communicate. After a brief conversation, he hung up the phone and slowly said to Charles, "Thank you." 73, Shorting Stark Industries. The plane slowly landed at New York Airport. 4 vehicles were waiting nearby, 2 Rolls-Royces, a military Humvee, and an ambulance. Pepper Potts, along with Happy, watched the plane as it descended. Colonel Rhodes from the military was also present with a group of soldiers. Everyone had gathered primarily to welcome Tony Stark and Charles back home. As the plane's door slowly opened, Pepper Potts, with teary eyes, saw Tony Stark walking out of the aircraft. Tony Stark was the first to step out of the plane. He looked at the stretcher that medical personnel had brought and waved them away, saying, "I'm fine, there's no need for that. Let them go." Seeing Tony Stark walking toward her, Pepper Potts, with red eyes but a joyful smile, stepped forward. Tony Stark approached Pepper Potts and said, "You've got red eyes. Were you worried about your boss?" Pepper Potts smiled and replied, "These are tears of joy. I hate job hunting." Tony Stark responded, "Well, the vacation is over." Meanwhile, Charles had also disembarked from the plane. He didn't come out immediately, giving Tony some space. Seeing Charles, Pepper Potts hurriedly took a step forward and thanked him, saying, "Thank you for bringing Tony back safely, Mr. Charles. The final payment will be transferred to your firm's account later." On the other hand, Tony interjected, "Pepper, remember to use the company account for the money and claim it as an expense." Charles chuckled and waved it off, saying, "You provide the funds, and I provide the effort. It's only fair. Next time you need assistance, remember to contact Charles's agency." Clearly, Charles knew that the appearance of the Iron Man suit marked the beginning of a significant event in the Marvel Universe, and the future would not be peaceful. Colonel Rhodes, who was standing nearby, saw Tony's empty space and immediately stepped forward for a hug. He said, "Buddy, don't disappear from my side again." Tony Stark returned the hug but didn't say much. After Pepper Potts expressed her gratitude to Charles, Tony Stark, who was standing nearby, spoke up, saying, "Charles, I'll get in touch with you when I have some free time. I'll definitely let you see my new masterpiece." It was evident that Tony couldn't forget Charles's ninja dog and the giant snake. After exchanging pleasantries, Tony Stark walked toward his Rolls-Royce. As the crowd saw Tony and the military personnel disperse, Ginny, who had been waiting nearby, approached and said, "Welcome back, boss." After a brief embrace between Charles and Ginny, they both got into Charles's Rolls-Royce. At the wheel was Irika Umino, who was responsible for driving. Charles asked, "Ginny, how did things go with the tasks I assigned you? Have you handled them? I thought you brought back Tony Stark's dead body this time, which is why I was bearish on Stark Industries. Given the current situation, it might lead to a rebound, causing us significant losses. Should we clear out all the short positions before news of Tony Stark's return gets out?" Charles smiled and said, "No, not only should we not clear them out, but once the remaining task commissions are received, we'll invest that money as well and maintain a bearish position on Stark Industries." "What?" Ginny asked in confusion, "I don't understand. What's going on?" This time, Charles didn't maintain any mystery and explained, "Let's get in the car, and once we check the latest news, you'll understand what's happening." Irika Umino, who was acting as the driver, asked, "Lord Charles, should we go to the agency or your apartment?" Charles casually replied, "Let's head to the agency." On the other side of town, Happy, who was driving another vehicle, asked, "Where are we going?" Pepper Potts spoke up first, "Please take us to the hospital, Happy." Tony Stark, seated beside her, refused, saying, "No." Pepper Potts, surprised, turned to Tony and insisted, "No, Tony, you must go to the hospital." Tony Stark refused once more, saying, "No, I said no." Pepper Potts explained on the side, "You absolutely need a medical checkup." Tony Stark retorted, "I don't need anything right now. I've been locked up for 3 whole months, and all I want to do is 2 things, eat an American hamburger and..." Hearing Tony's words, Pepper Potts interrupted, her face cold, "Don't say another word." Seeing that Pepper had misunderstood, Tony clarified, "It's not what you're thinking. I want to hold a press conference." Upon hearing it wasn't about hiring models, Pepper Potts asked in surprise, "A press conference?" Tony looked towards Happy, who was in the driver's seat, and said, "Yes, Happy, start the car." Pepper Potts was still puzzled and asked, "Why do you want to hold a press conference?" Tony didn't answer Pepper's question but simply said, "Let's go grab those hamburgers first." Without hesitation, Happy started the car, driving them away from the airport. On the other hand, Charles had already returned to his agency. Ginny received a phone call and then said, "Boss, your beloved car has been repaired. Where would you like it delivered?" Hearing that his Mercedes 300 SL had finally been fixed, Charles thought to himself, "It's been a long time, but it's finally getting repaired. I was even considering other vehicles." He then replied, "Deliver it to Charles's agency." "Understood, boss." Meanwhile, Irika Umino sat at the service desk, going through mission listings from the Continental Hotel. Ginny, on the other hand, attended to other matters, such as handling large sums of money and investing them in the stock market, not an easy task. After Charles returned to his room in the agency, he poured a glass of blackjack whiskey, added ice and a splash of cola. After taking a sip, he found the taste satisfying. Lying on the bed, Charles entered the system space. He opened the mission guild and saw that the mission to rescue Tony Stark was marked as completed. He immediately clicked to claim the rewards. Ding! Congratulations! You have completed a B-rank mission. You have received 2,000 reputation points, 200,000 copper coins, and a regular treasure chest. As for the missions involving Rock Lee and Suzuki, they were not completed yet, so he couldn't claim any rewards. System, perform the daily check-in. Ding! Check-in successful. You have been rewarded with 50 gold coins. Upon hearing that it was a gold coin reward, Charles, who had been lying on the bed, immediately sat up. Number. More chapters, 75 plus p at trian.com/kfc. Comment. 3 comment. Vote. Chapter 74, Chapter 074, Weapons Manufacturing Division closed. Bonus chapter. Tony Stark arrived at the press conference in a Rolls-Royce, amidst the cheers of the crowd. As soon as the car came to a stop, Obadiah Stane, who was present, rushed forward, opened the car door, and exclaimed, "Look, Tony's here." As Tony stepped out of the car, Obadiah approached him with a hug and called out Tony's name with joy. After the warm embrace, Obadiah let go of Tony, wearing a smile, and patted Tony on the shoulder, saying, "I thought I'd have to visit you in the hospital." Tony Stark turned to glance at Pepper Potts in the car and said, No, I'm fine." At this moment, Happy and Pepper Potts got out of the car from the other side and walked around to the back. Happy was holding a hamburger in his hand. Obadiah, standing nearby, patted Tony Stark on the shoulder and said, "Let me take a look at you first." Tony Stark didn't respond to Obadiah and instead turned to take a hamburger from Happy's hand, saying, "Thanks." Obadiah, seeing this, sighed and asked, "Do you really have to eat a hamburger?" "Oh, do you want one?" Tony replied, holding the hamburger as he walked towards the press conference venue. He then turned to Obadiah, saying, "There's only one left." Upon reaching the press conference venue, Tony and Obadiah waved to the crowd. Obadiah even shouted, "Hey, welcome, everyone." At this moment, Pepper Potts stood at the edge of the crowd of reporters, wearing a smile on her face as she watched Tony Stark approach. At this moment, a man standing nearby suddenly spoke, "Miss Potts." Hearing the voice, Pepper Potts turned to face the man who had spoken and replied, "Yes, it's me." The man, Phil Coulson, looked at Pepper Potts and said, "Can we talk for a moment?" Pepper Potts declined, saying, "No, I'm not here for the press conference, and the conference is about to begin." Phil Coulson explained, "I'm not a journalist. I'm Agent Coulson, with the Department of Homeland Strategic Defense Attack and Logistics Support Bureau. After introducing himself, Coulson handed Pepper his business card. Pepper Potts glanced at the business card in Coulson's hand and said, "It sounds pretty complicated." She then accepted the business card from him. Coulson saw Pepper take the business card and said, "Yes, it's being simplified." Pepper put away the business card and said, "Regarding this matter, the Department of Defense, the FBI, and the CIA have all contacted us." Coulson responded, "We belong to a different system, specifically handling these kinds of affairs. We need to learn more about Stark's escape and the details of Charles Doyle's rescue." Pepper's expression changed, and she put away her smile. She responded coldly, "I'll convey your message to him, okay? As for Charles Doyle, I have no control over that." Coulson smiled and said, "Thank you." At this point, Tony Stark sat down at the press conference under the podium, took out another hamburger from his pocket, and shouted, "Hey, everyone, why don't you all take a seat? That way, you can all see me, and I can point at you for question." At this moment, Rhodey had just arrived at the press conference venue and looked at the scene. He curiously asked Pepper Potts, "What's happening at the press conference?" Pepper Potts turned to look at him, then continued to gaze at Tony while saying, "Don't ask me, I have no idea what performance he's putting on." At the podium, Tony, with a hamburger in one hand, looked at Obadiah and said, "I'm very happy." Obadiah extended a hand, placed it on Tony's shoulder, and smiled, saying, "Me too." Tony stared at him and slowly spoke, "I never got to say goodbye to my dad." Then, he turned to the reporters and put the hamburger aside, speaking with a serious tone, "I never got to say goodbye to my dad, and there are questions I never got to ask him. I wanted to ask him what he thought about this company. Whether he had ever had doubts or conflicts in his heart. Maybe he wasn't the person we often saw in the news. I've seen young people killed by weapons I designed to protect them. And I've realized that I've become a part of a system that is completely irresponsible." As Tony Stark's words fell, a reporter suddenly spoke up, "I'm sorry, Mr. Stark." Tony stood up in response to the reporter's question but didn't answer. Instead, he said, "You can ask." At this point, another reporter asked, "What happened there?" Upon hearing the reporter's question, Tony stood up and continued, "I woke up as if from a dream, and I began to realize that I can do more for this world, for society. So, I'm preparing to close down the weapons manufacturing division of Stark Industries as soon as possible." With Tony's words, there was an uproar in the audience. Pepper Potts was astonished, her mouth wide open in shock. Obadiah stood up and hurriedly approached Tony, placing a hand on his shoulder. Tony continued, "Of course, that will depend on me having enough authority to decide the company's future, to ensure it can develop in a healthy manner and always be in line with the country's highest interests." At this moment, Rhodey had a serious expression and looked at Tony Stark with great gravity. After Tony finished speaking, he walked down from the podium. Obadiah immediately took the microphone and explained, "Today's press conference is mainly to announce that Tony is back. And his health is excellent. We will hold a meeting within the company to discuss further details, and we will inform everyone in a timely manner." On the other side, after completing the sign-in, Charles immediately looked at his gold coins, and the number on it changed from 1,148 to 1,198. Charles Doyle clenched his fist, made a gesture of encouragement, and shouted, "Yes." He opened the store, found the ninja recruitment scrolls, and spent gold coins to purchase 7 of them in one go, bringing the total number of ninja recruitment scrolls back to 10. However, his gold coin balance plummeted to 22, dropping to double digits. Looking at the cross on the ninja recruitment scroll, Charles Doyle didn't immediately recruit ninjas. Instead, he exited the system space. He wanted to prepare properly before recruiting the ninjas. Chapter 75, 10 consecutive draws. Charles started by taking a bath and changing into clean clothes. Then, he inspected the bathroom, and finally, he moved to the empty space in the living room. He lit some candles and placed several gold bricks around them. He also set up delicious ramen, hamburgers, fried chicken, and cola in the vicinity of the candles. With his left hand placed over his chest, he chanted, "Oh, wise one from a different era, mysterious master above the mist, the black and yellow king of good fortune, please listen to my prayer. I beseech you to grant me a powerful ninja as I desire." After completing the prayer ritual, Charles's consciousness entered the system space. Ninja recruitment, 10 consecutive draws, go. The swirling whirlpool symbol of the Hidden Leaf Village appeared before his eyes, emitting a peculiar radiance. After a dazzling display of light, the recruitment results appeared in Charles's vision. Ding! Obtained a B-rank ninja, 1 fragment of Naruto, Shippuden Tenten. Ding! Obtained a C-rank ninja, 1 fragment of Naruto Uzumaki. Ding! Obtained an A-rank ninja, 4 fragments of Might Guy. Ding! Obtained a C-rank ninja, 2 fragments of Ninja Academy Naruto. Ding! Obtained a C-rank ninja, S.H.I.E.L.D. Ding! Obtained an A-rank ninja, 1 fragment of Boruto, Naruto Next Generation's Mitsuki. Ding! Obtained a B-rank ninja, 4 fragments of Young Kakashi Hatake. Ding! Obtained a C-rank ninja, 2 fragments of Rin Nohara. Ding! Obtained a C-rank ninja, 1 fragment of Temari of the Sand. Ding! Obtained a C-rank ninja, 1 fragment of Jirobo. Observing the subtitles that popped up on the screen, Charles congratulated himself for successfully recruiting C-rank ninja S.H.I.E.L.D. Next, he saw her in the Japanese-style outfit from the manga. Although S.H.I.E.L.D. was rated as a C-rank ninja in the Naruto mobile game, she was undoubtedly a bona fide jonin at this point. Most importantly, she was an exceptionally skilled medical ninja, making her a valuable asset. Charles wouldn't even trade her for a B-rank ninja. He opened S.H.I.E.L.D.'s details and immediately checked her ninja skills. S.H.I.E.L.D., C-rank ninja. Skills: Ninjutsu, Poison Mist, Senbon Rain, Swine Return, Piggy Dance. Ninjutsu, Poison Mist, converts chakra and spews it forward, instantly transforming it into a large poison mist upon contact with the air. The mist continuously corrodes enemies it touches. Senbon Rain, leaps backward and fires a barrage of poison needles at the ground. Enemies hit by the poison needles will be poisoned. Those with lower strength and low poison resistance will die directly, while those with higher resistance will suffer continued poisoning, harming their bodies. Swine Return, Piggy Dance, summons Tauntaun to charge forward and ram enemies. S.H.I.E.L.D. then uses a chakra scalpel to perform a rapid cross-cutting technique. Finally, she leaps backward and delivers another slashing attack, heavily injuring the enemy. Looking at the 3 skills, especially the chakra scalpel in her ultimate move, Charles knew he finally had his medical ninja. After the candlelight prayer, he had finally welcomed his medical ninja, a future head of the medical department. She had trained under Tsunade for many years, making her a highly formidable medical ninja. While she might not be on par with Tsunade, she was undoubtedly one of the top medical ninjas in the shinobi world. Charles was quite satisfied with this recruitment. Although he hadn't obtained a powerful ninja, he had found a significant addition to his medical skills. He also wished for a ninja with scientific research abilities, but he knew that characters like Orochimaru, Sasori, and Deidara, who excelled in research, were of A or even S rank, making them difficult to recruit. He didn't have high hopes for them at the moment. However, he felt that this summon gave pretty decent results. Thinking about how he only needed one more 10 consecutive draw to guarantee S-rank ninja fragments, Charles felt more confident. He clicked to receive the ninja fragments, and his chakra once again grew stronger. He now possessed S.H.I.E.L.D.'s 3 active skills, including the chakra scalpel technique, although he lacked any medical knowledge. With 3 more chances to use the Chidori now, Charles nodded in satisfaction. He then shifted his attention to the ninja fragments he had obtained. Adding the 4 fragments of Might Guy to the 4 fragments from his previous summon, he now had a total of 8 fragments, which was 1/5 of the way to recruiting him. It gave him a feeling that success might not be too far off. Even the fragments of the young Kakashi Hatake, whom Parker admired, appeared in this summon, and he obtained 4 fragments right away. In addition, Ninja Academy students Naruto and Konohamaru were even closer to being recruited. Charles had even obtained a fragment of Mitsuki from the Boruto series. In this 10 consecutive summon, he obtained a total of 17 fragments, including 5 A rank, 4 B rank, and 8 C rank ninja fragments, along with a medical ninja. It could be said that this summon was quite rewarding. Surprisingly, he didn't get a single fragment of Hinata Hyuga, but he did obtain fragments of Temari instead. It seemed likely that if he tried a few more times, he would have a good chance of recruiting her. With all the recruited ninja fragments safely collected, Charles checked his ninja roster. 4 ninja were displayed: Irika Umino, Rock Lee, Sharingan Sasuke Uchiha, Merged, and S.H.I.E.L.D. S.H.I.E.L.D. had not been deployed for battle yet, but the other 3 were marked as deployed. Seeing this situation, Charles furrowed his brow. He didn't want to recall any of the 3 deployed ninja to make room for S.H.I.E.L.D. However, S.H.I.E.L.D, as a medical ninja, was highly valuable. He tapped on the & sign in the deploy column, and a prompt appeared. Ding! Would you like to use 1000 gold coins to unlock a deploy slot? The first time he increased the deploy slots, it cost 100 gold coins, and the second time it was 500 gold coins. Today, for the third increase, it had become 1000 gold coins. Charles didn't know how much the cost would multiply for each additional slot, but he was aware of his current financial situation. He was nearly broke, with only 22 gold coins remaining. Seeing the big number 1000 gold coins and his meager 22 gold coins, Charles realized that dealing with the dragon vein matter was becoming urgent. If he didn't want to recall one of his deployed ninja, he needed to figure out a way to obtain items for recharging and unlock new deploy slots. As for whether the dragon vein could indeed be used for recharging, Charles was not entirely sure. It was still just a guess, and he hadn't confirmed it yet. Exiting the system space, Charles looked at the spread of food and the candles that were still burning. He extinguished the candles and stored them away. He also stashed the delicious ramen into the system space. Then, he started devouring the hamburgers, fried chicken and cola that were in front of him. Since the deity hadn't taken these items away, he decided to fill his stomach with them.
Thanks for listening.